Who were the Hussites and why did everyone fear them?
How could a bunch of poor peasants and lowly townspeople overthrow a kingdom and stand alone against the emperor, the pope, the whole Christian world?
On our show, we are going to tell you the whole tragic, epic, astonishing story set in the very heart of Europe.
In the kingdom of Bohemia and its capital, the city of Prague in the Middle Ages.
The venerable Palatine Chapel in the German city of Aachen is packed with nobles and princes from all across the continent.
Its golden ceiling glitters in the reflected sunlight of a bright summer day. The year is 1376.
It's sweltering hot outside, but the air in the chapel is cool, pleasant, and full of anticipation.
The new king of the Romans will be crowned today, but this will be no ordinary coronation.
And its consequences will change the fate of Europe for decades to come.
The Archbishop of Cologne, not even 30, yet adorned in full priestly regalia, asks the ceremonial questions, and his voice resonates among the vaulted arches and the magnificent dome.
Will you maintain the laws of the empire? Will you maintain justice? Will you show due submission to the Pope?
I will, answers the young boy, barely 15 winters old, who is to be a king.
He then sits atop the ancient marble throne of great Charlemagne,
accepts the scepter, the sword, the ring, the orb, and finally, the crown.
Fiat! The roar of his new subjects echoes through the chapel.
Eyes of the new king scan the assembled crowd of nobles and dignitaries.
Their faces seem uncertain, apprehensive, as if they weren't sure whether to take this all seriously. As if they already knew that their new monarch would plunge the realm into chaos and bloodshed.
The only face beaming with hope, merriment, and pride belongs to the guest of honor,
Charles IV, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and the most powerful man in all of Europe.
Usually, the king of the Romans is crowned after the death of the old emperor, the first step towards imperial coronation in Rome itself. Usually, the king and the emperor are one person. But there's nothing usual about this.
The young king's name is Wenceslaus of Bohemia. The emperor is his father, and against tradition, he just let his son be crowned while he was still alive. By doing this, Charles wanted to ensure the survival of his legacy. It was meant to be his masterstroke, a crowning achievement, empowering his house for ages to come.
But it was a terrible mistake.
Wenceslaus will never become emperor. He will be stripped of his kingship, and Europe will burn. My name is Vašek.
And I am Alžběta.
And this is Bloody Heart of Europe.
In 2005, during a television poll, the people of the Czech Republic voted for the greatest person in their nation's history. They overwhelmingly chose Wenceslaus's father, Emperor Charles of the House of Luxembourg. The reasons were quite obvious. If you ever visited Prague and walked along its streets, the lasting impact of this great monarch is visible to this day. Charles founded one of Europe's oldest universities and built a famous bridge bearing his name. He continued building the lavish St. Vitus Cathedral and founded Prague's new town. He ruled the Kingdom of Bohemia, a realm roughly corresponding to modern-day Czechia. And during his reign, Bohemia prospered. But that wasn't his only achievement. Charles was also the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, an overarching realm of which Bohemia was only a part.
The Holy Roman Empire was the most powerful political body in Europe. But it was also a bit weird when compared to other kingdoms of the day. For starters, it was absolutely huge. It encompassed today's Germany, Austria, Czechia, Switzerland, parts of Poland, Italy, France, and the Balkans. If your European geography isn't up to scratch, that is almost 2 times the territory of Texas. How could the emperors manage to rule over such a vast expanse of land when news, messages, and people could move at the speed of a horse and no faster? In short, the supposed country was actually fragmented into semi-independent kingdoms, duchies, and counties that sometimes listened to their emperor and cooperated against external enemies, but just as often rebelled or waged war against one another.
By all accounts, running this strange land was a bureaucratic nightmare. And to make matters even more confusing, the imperial succession was a bit of a mess as well. Instead of the tried and tested, my eldest son inherits the throne after me, the emperor was elected, not democratically by the will of the people, of course, but by a select few noblemen and priests, powerful men who often looked to their own profit first and foremost. Instead of choosing the best candidate, they could deliberately elect a weak man who could be easily controlled. Bribery and corruption were also an option for an ambitious nobleman who wished to wear the imperial crown.
As a ruler of the empire, Charles of Luxembourg was something of an oddity. Whereas some of his predecessors were rendered completely impotent in the face of inner strife, politicking, and backstabbing, Charles managed the demands of the job extremely well. In fact, he became a true giant of European history. During his reign in the 14th century, he brought peace, stability, and progress to the realm. He was a shrewd diplomat and a talented manager, always on the move, visiting far-flung corners of the empire to keep the bickering kingdoms and duchies together. And when he rested in Prague, which he made the capital of his realm.
He succeeded in everything he set out to do, except for one thing. Across 2 marriages, he could not produce a male heir to the throne, at least not one who could survive to adulthood. It was his 3rd wife, Anna of Schweidnitz, who finally gave him a healthy son. The emperor was 45, hardly a young father by today's standards, an old man in his time. After all, his father died at the age of 50, his grandfather aged 40, but nothing could spoil such a precious moment. You can feel Charles's joy across the centuries, most palpably from the letters he sent to people across his kingdom. Quote,
"All Bohemia, together with the surrounding countries, rejoice at the great happiness that has befallen you. You rich and poor, young and old, one as well as the other, rejoice. We have a son. Rejoice, dear faithful ones. He relieves you of the fear of seeing our royal tree dead, and thus the kingdom brought to ruin. We have a prince. The noble day of his birth was a glorious day for us. His coming was like the rising of the dawn that drives away the mist. At last, we have a prince."
End quote. The young heir's name was Wenceslaus, and he was his father's most ambitious project. Charles wanted to create a lasting, stable version of the empire, and he had a brilliant idea how to do it. What if the King of Bohemia and the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire were always the same man? Then it would finally become a true united country with the seat of power in Prague.
Wenceslaus was a key component in his father's master plan. He would become the first undisputed successor. He would show the empire that petty squabbles were not necessary. He would carry on his father's torch and build a strong dynasty of House Luxembourg that would lead Europe to prosperity.
But the clock was ticking for the emperor who, remember, was way past his prime. Charles saw old age knocking at the door, and he knew he had to start immediately. If it meant caution would be thrown to the wind, so be it.
Even before he celebrated his first birthday, the baby Wenceslaus became a part of the realm's upper management. It sounds completely ridiculous, but the first official document signed in Wenceslaus's name came just 5 months after his birth.
It was supposed to show the world that the son and the father were equal rulers from the very beginning. But that wasn't enough for Charles. The man who was famous for his strategic thinking began to use reckless, drastic measures, such as when 2 years later he crowned his son a king.
It was an absurd idea. Wenceslaus was just an infant at the time, and Charles, the actual king, was alive and well. It meant breaking the coronation rite, but no rules seemingly applied to Charles or his firstborn.
In the beginning of the episode, we already talked about the unprecedented imperial coronation in the German city of Aachen, which would come 13 years after. But the first step on that road was made here, when a toddler became the king of Bohemia.
Picture the scene. A small child in full regalia, unable to correctly repeat the Latin phrases, the crown much too big for his head. According to one harsh chronicle, Wenceslaus was crying the whole time and even defecated all over the holy altar. It was far from the sacred ritual it was supposed to be. Obviously, many powerful people found it highly disrespectful, but in the end, they didn't dare to challenge the emperor.
The 2-year-old Wenceslaus was, therefore, a king. Of course, he didn't have any true power. His father decided everything, and yet, despite the lack of real responsibilities, the young heir wasn't allowed to have a normal childhood. To create a veneer of authority, Charles involved Wenceslaus in all the kingly activities. He was sending his son on diplomatic missions abroad, made him preside over the Bohemian Provincial Assembly, appointed him the head of the tribute ceremonies. Wenceslaus couldn't possibly understand what was happening around him. Every single decision he supposedly made was prepared in advance by others.
Wenceslaus was growing up in his father's unescapable shadow, unable to form his own path. His formal education didn't help. From an early age, he was surrounded by tutors, 2 successive archbishops of Prague. You can imagine what that was like. Serious, religious old men who accentuated virtues such as humility and always listening to a power greater than yourself. They would be dull lessons for an adult, let alone a little boy who just wanted to chase other kids in the garden. But it didn't matter. Young Wenceslaus had a royal seal to play with, instead of toy horses.
When Wenceslaus was 7 years old, another son was born to Emperor Charles, Prince Sigismund. You might expect that Charles would now divide his attention between both his sons, that he would perhaps stop trying to control every single aspect of Wenceslaus's life. But that didn't happen. From the very beginning, Sigismund was an afterthought in the mind of the great emperor. After all, Charles already had his firstborn, his God-given crown prince. So the royal charade continued without change.
When Wenceslaus turned 15 years old, he legally became an adult. He should have been ready to rule by now. His father's overwhelming attentions should at least have succeeded in preparing him for what was to come. But it soon became clear that Wenceslaus was not ready at all.
The reality was that all the lessons and experiences of rulership were just for show. Wenceslaus's signature was proliferated on royal charters, But the young king didn't even have his own office or clerks. He presided over assemblies all over the country, but did nothing more than observe the proceedings. And when Charles's army went into battle, he made sure that Wenceslas arrived too late to take part in the fighting, but just in time to win some glory for himself.
All this undeserved success made Wenceslas believe his own hype. He was, or would soon be, the most important man in Europe. He ruled a kingdom since he was a baby, and he never encountered any problems he couldn't fix. Yes, his father may have helped here and there, but without him, Wenceslas would surely manage just fine.
He must have felt pretty confident that hot summer day in Germany we already talked about in the very beginning of the episode. The day of the unprecedented coronation, the day when the 15-year-old became the king of the Romans, or the king of the Germans. You can encounter both terms in the history books, and they mean the same thing, the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire.
But how did we even get there? What made the lords and nobles of the empire accept this Nepo baby as their new king? Plainly speaking, money did. The election of Wenceslas was made possible by a whole lot of bribery, underhanded machinations, and concessions by Emperor Charles.
Remember, the position of the king of the Romans was not hereditary. A ruler had to be elected by a collection of high-ranking nobles and priests. Among the potential candidates would be various dukes and counts of the empire, all powerful men in their own right. So, if the slowly ailing Charles wanted to secure his son's succession to the imperial throne, he had to be smart about it.
He needed votes, so he resorted to buying them. The plan was simple. There were many powerful cities in the empire, rich, influential, and in possession of special rights and privileges. But Charles needed the support of the nobility, not the merchants. So, he transferred those privileges to the princes, who would in exchange vote for Wenceslas. Smart, easy, painless. Just the kind of strategic ploy the emperor was famous for.
So it seemed at that time anyway. The scheme did work and Charles got what he wanted. But in the long run, it proved far too clumsy. It alienated the cities whose commerce was the lifeblood of the realm. Throughout his life, Charles tried to promote stability and internal peace in the empire. But with this gambit, he shattered that stability. Without even realizing it, he committed a devastating strategic error. He wouldn't personally be bothered by it. By the time the consequences struck, the emperor would be long dead. So, the mistakes of the father would have to be paid for by the son.
1 year after Wenceslas's German coronation, Charles was ailing fast. The 61-year-old emperor probably suffered from gout, which made his joints into sources of constant pain. In spite of his illness, he accompanied his beloved son to France for one last voyage. This was a much more impressive feat than it sounds. By this time, Charles was extremely frail for such a draining journey. To illustrate how poor his health was at this time, Charles wanted to see holy relics at the top of a cathedral tower in Paris. But there was no way he could reach them on his own. So, the great emperor whose word ruled Europe had to be hauled up the stairs like a sack of turnips.
It may seem undignified, but it tells you something important about Charles. The old emperor was always on the move, always charging forward, even when his body couldn't sustain it any longer. The strength of his will, determination, and stubbornness were stunning. And they were the exact qualities his heir lacked the most.
A year later, the inevitable happened. The mighty emperor was finally betrayed by his own body. He died of pneumonia at the age of 62. We can only guess what went through Wenceslas's head when he followed his father's coffin through the streets of Prague. He had just lost his second parent, His mother died years earlier, and now his father, who always watched over him, was gone as well. He must have felt very young and very lonely, in spite of the hundreds of his father's knights and nobles in the magnificent funeral procession.
Charles left both the Kingdom of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire to his son. And what seems clear to us in retrospect quickly became apparent to the rest of Europe as well. The 17-year-old Wenceslaus was not up to the task.
Let's be clear in one respect. The task wasn't easy, and to live up to the previous emperor was barely possible. Charles was a rarity, a man of unquestionable talent, intelligence, and charisma. What's more, his upbringing, so much harsher than the one he prepared for his son, made him resilient, realistic, and focused on his goals. He possessed an innate ability to do everything by himself, to micromanage the empire through every nook and cranny of European politics. Solving the realm's issues was something akin to a fun puzzle for him. But he wasn't able to transfer these qualities to his son.
Even if Wenceslaus had been more like his father, the situation he found himself in at the beginning of his reign would still be deeply troublesome. The nobility didn't really respect him. He was drowning in debt from all the bribery Charles had to do to get him elected. The cities, which were stripped of their privileges by the old emperor, weren't happy. Their wealth could pay for whole mercenary armies, and they threatened war over their lost advantages.
Looking beyond the borders of the empire, Wenceslaus didn't have any obvious allies. Other important European monarchs were busy fighting the 100 Years' War. Europe still felt the ramifications of the Black Death plague epidemic that killed millions. And the whole continent was spiritually torn apart by the papal schism, which saw two competing popes trying to rule Christendom.
Wenceslaus tried to put all those fires out. He attempted to continue his father's policies. He traveled frequently. He cared about the realm. He called together a grand assembly of the imperial nobility, but soon found out that barely anybody would come, so he cancelled the event. Disappointed, but undeterred, he organized another meeting. This time, the noblemen did grace the monarch with their presence, but the proceedings descended into chaos. Arguments broke out among various attendees. No one could agree on anything. The king's efforts to restore a semblance of order were ignored. Something like that would be utterly unthinkable when his father was still on the throne.
The times were dark and dangerous, and it's worth mentioning that Wenceslaus did more or less succeed in maintaining the king's peace in the empire. He also managed to marry his sister, Anne of Bohemia, to Richard II, the King of England. Wenceslaus thus gained a valuable ally. Still, barely avoiding wholesale civil war and arranging a single profitable marriage, those weren't the glorious achievements you'd hope for from the heir of the great Charles.
The international situation regarding the church wasn't much better. Wenceslaus staunchly supported the Pope in Rome against his rival in the French city of Avignon. But the rest of Europe stayed divided on the issue. Even Wenceslaus's people, the Czechs of Bohemia, wouldn't fall in line. The king's own cousin, a powerful nobleman, Jost of Moravia, who will become very important to this story later on, stubbornly clung to the Pope in Avignon.
What's more, the Roman Pope, through his loyal Archbishop of Prague named Jan of Jenstein, started trying to control Wenceslaus, to dictate what the king should or shouldn't do, instead of being an equal ally. In time, this would drive Wenceslaus away from the Pope, and the Archbishop Jenstein would become the king's mortal enemy.
Then there was the situation with the title of Emperor. Wenceslaus already ruled the Holy Roman Empire, yes, but he ruled it under the less prestigious title of the King of the Romans. To be crowned emperor would grant him no additional territory or significant powers. Still, it would come with a whole lot of new dignity and gravitas, extremely useful for a young, untested ruler. Wenceslaus knew he needed the support of his nobles in order to win the imperial crown. And if he got the crown, perhaps he would also gain their respect. But they wouldn't let him be crowned without respecting him first. Wenceslaus's dad would surely find a way out of this catch-22, invent a brilliant political strategy, divide and conquer the impudent princes. But he was gone now. The king was alone.
Year after year, he met with nothing but setbacks. It must have felt like repeatedly slamming your head against a wall. There are problems everywhere, but nobody listens to you, doesn't trust you to solve them. All your power turns out to be just an illusion. What are you supposed to do then?
Wenceslaus slowly but surely gave up. Every intense negotiation, every dispute he was unable to settle, came with a heavy cost to the king's mental well-being. He would hide away in one of his castles, drink, hunt, have fun with his friends. Over time, the periods of Wenceslaus's inaction grew longer and longer. Then, after half a decade of trying, he retreated back to the relative comfort of Bohemia. The vast realm of the Holy Roman Empire became almost an afterthought.
The inner circle around Wenceslaus also changed drastically. The embittered king who couldn't be emperor became more and more dismissive towards his father's old advisors, and instead started surrounding himself with people he liked. These weren't experienced nobles like before. He spent his whole childhood with men like that. No, when he chose his own companions, he preferred men of lower status, men who weren't bogged down in the world of complicated politics. There was a problem, though. Such people might be good for lifting your spirits, but they are certainly not the best help in managing an empire.
If you think this starts to sound like a recipe for disaster, you are absolutely right. Soon, even the kingdom of Bohemia was seemingly too much to handle for Wenceslaus. He more and more often completely disappeared from the public eye, instead spending an outrageous amount of time hunting wild game.
We have a preserved record that almost comically illustrates how bad things got in Bohemia. Bonifacio de Lupi, an Italian diplomat, wrote an account of his journey to negotiate a signature on important documents. He was sent to visit the king, but the king was nowhere to be found. In fact, almost no one from the royal council was present in Prague. Instead, they were lounging in a countryside castle and admitting no visitors. The king was so serious about the rule that he even burned down houses around the castle, so that potential visitors would have nowhere to be accommodated. And when Bonifacio insisted he had to see Wenceslaus, one of the king's noble friends asked him for a significant bribe.
The diplomat did eventually get to see the king, after weeks of delay. But Wenceslaus was interested in one thing and one thing only. Did the Italians bring some fancy hunting weapons with them? Bonifacio left Bohemia completely exasperated at the state of imperial affairs.
The whole situation reads like a comedy, and the picture it paints is stark. After just a few years of ineffectual rule, Wenceslaus turned into a disinterested, disillusioned king, unwilling to even try anymore. Sometimes he sent delegations to negotiate in his name. Other times, he gave up important positions just so a problem would go away. If you rule a massive country full of power-hungry nobles, such weakening of your authority is bound to have consequences. Wenceslaus will find out the hard way when he gets thrown in a prison cell.
But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For all of Wenceslaus's many faults, he still retained a modicum of respect. To lose it, he would have to do something truly outrageous. something that would shock the nobles into action. Say, personally murdering an innocent priest.
You see, Wenceslas's disinterest in ruling didn't manifest only through boredom and apathy. He also lacked patience and was prone to fits of intense anger. This played a huge role during the king's struggle with the Archbishop Jan of Wienstein, the loyal crony of the Pope in Rome. A struggle which culminated in a truly bizarre, scandalous confrontation.
The details of the conflict aren't important for our story. Suffice to say, the king and the archbishop had a long history of disagreements. It all came to a head with the appointment of an abbot without the king's approval. A seemingly minor issue was the last straw that left the king absolutely furious. And the way he reacted shattered his reputation across Christendom. We have a detailed account of the whole exchange because the archbishop later complained about it to the pope. First, the king wrote an angry letter. Quote,
"You, Archbishop, return to me the castle of Rodnice and my other castles, and depart from my Bohemian land. If you attempt anything against me or my people, I intend to drown you and remove the strife. Come to Prague."
End quote. Curiously, despite the threatening nature of the king's message, Jan of Wienstein did come to Prague. And he regretted his decision very soon. He found the king drunk and in an apoplectic state. Wenceslaus screamed insults in the archbishop's face, threatened to cut off his head, and then ordered the guards to arrest Jan and his delegation. According to the archbishop, the king then once again succumbed to his obsession with drowning people. By the way, this is less weird than it sounds. In medieval times, drowning was considered an appropriate punishment for a fallen priest. Still, it had to be absolutely terrifying for Jan and his friends. Quoting the archbishop,
To the others the king threatened, "I will drown you and you." When I knelt down before him several times, seeking to appease his anger, he also mockingly knelt down before me on both knees.
End quote. The archbishop managed to escape in the confusion, but the rest of his delegation weren't as lucky. They were taken in for questioning. It took hours, but the priests didn't give the king the answers he wanted, which only made him more furious. Still drunk, he decided to subject 2 of them to intense torture. He had them put on the rack and then had their toes crushed with a thumbscrew. Then, in a truly insane turn of events, the king of the Romans decided to join in personally. He took a torch and burned the sides of his bound prisoners until their skin was marred with blisters.
After grueling hours of torture, the king grew tired and also finally sobered up. Slowly, he realized what he had done. Even a king cannot torture priests in a dungeon and evade consequences. So he tried to pressure his prisoners to promise not to tell anyone what happened, in exchange for their freedom. Some agreed, but he couldn't convince them all. The vicar John of Nepomuk didn't survive the brutal torture. The king reacted in a fashion of a true mob boss. He had his men dump the corpse in the river, bound in a hog tie so it wouldn't float. But the truth couldn't stay hidden now. John of Nepomuk would eventually become a saint of Bohemia for his martyrdom, and Wenceslaus would be known as the king who murdered a priest.
Now, we are not quite certain how much of this is accurate. After all, our primary source is Jan of Wienstein, a man with a vested interest in seeing the king discredited. But we know that John of Nepomuk did die of torture, and that his corpse did bear signs of burning. Whether Wenceslaus was personally present or not, the whole episode became a horrible scandal that made many powerful people deeply angry at their king. This, coupled with Wenceslaus's failure to rule effectively, meant that the pressure cooker was finally ready to explode.
Thus, in the 16th year of Wenceslaus's reign, when the king was 33 years old, the League of Lords was born. Some of the oldest noble houses in Bohemia banded together, decided to take matters into their own hands, and rebelled. Often, when nobles rise against their king, they aim to depose him and replace him with someone else. But this was not the case here. The rebels wanted to cut the king down to size, sure, but they also wished to keep him on the throne. One of their most important objectives was instead to remove the petty nobles Wenceslaus surrounded himself with, and to install themselves into positions of power next to the king. They thought that given the chance, they could control Wenceslaus and make him do their bidding.
It's always a risky business rebelling against your liege lord, and the repercussions could be lethal if the enterprise failed. But the League of Lords succeeded, and it succeeded in a spectacular fashion. The lords with their soldiers lay in wait for Wenceslaus while he traveled through the countryside with his retinue, catching them unawares in an ambush. The king surrendered without a fight. The rebels then took the king back to Prague Castle, imprisoned him there, and presented him with their demands, including more power in the hands of the nobility. The king must have been horribly shaken by the speed and suddenness of the events, especially as one of the chief rebel lords was his cousin, the aforementioned Jošt of Moravia. He caved almost immediately, signing everything the rebels wanted. They stayed true to their word and let him go.
Wenceslaus was free again, but politically weaker and enormously embarrassed in front of the whole of the empire. The positions of power near the throne were filled with traitors, including those of the king's own family. Other rulers might have tried to get vengeance, to execute their captors, to gain back what they had lost. Not the tired, confused king of Bohemia. He just slinked back to a hunting retreat with his tail between his legs and drank the days away.
If Wenceslaus ever reflected on the successes of his reign thus far, it probably didn't make for a very happy contemplation. He wore the crown of a king, but the emperorship was as unreachable as ever. He didn't father a son to inherit his realm. He hadn't solved the papal schism. The empire was fractured and viciously insubordinate. In short, the God-given prince failed to live up to his father's legacy. You might argue that his father failed him first, that Wenceslaus's upbringing was ill-conceived and counterproductive. But does any of that really matter? The reality was that the king was useless, and everybody knew it.
You might reasonably think that it just couldn't get any worse for Wenceslaus. But these were not reasonable times. A much more devastating family betrayal lurked just beyond the horizon. Do you remember Wenceslaus's brother Sigismund, the boy who grew up in the shadow of his older sibling, unloved and unnoticed by his illustrious father? Well, the boy is now a man and a king in his own right. And he will stop at nothing to achieve his ultimate ambition, to become the greatest monarch of the age.
Young King of Hungary sits upon a magnificent warhorse. Angry tears are slowly crawling their way into the bushy red beard, which will one day become the source of his infamous nickname. The knights of his bodyguard are milling about, unsure whether to charge forward or run away.
But just one gaze upon the bloody battlefield is enough to confirm that in truth, there is only one option left.
The Turks are everywhere. The feared Sipahis are blowing trumpets, slaughtering enemies and praising their god.
Men die by the hundreds, speared through, cut down, trampled by hooves. All resistance is broken.
Damn them!
Mutters the king through gritted teeth.
Damn those proud fools! It was he who brought them all here. It was he who led the call for a military strike against the encroaching Ottomans. It was he who stood at the head of the Holy Crusade, meant to save Europe from the threat of Islam.
But did the great lords and princes listen when he insisted on careful approach? Did they deem him worthy to lead them into battle? Did they follow his plans? No. Instead, they charged stupidly and died uselessly, spearheaded by the vainglorious French with their delusions of knightly honor.
The red-haired king remembers his own words uttered not so long ago. Who would be so bold as to dare to resist us? If the enormous weight of the sky were to fall on us, with spears that we carry, we would hold it up.
That day in his capital at Buda, it seemed true. The army stood proudly, in splendid rows, bearing the sign of the cross. A fragmented Europe had come together against a common enemy. Yet that unity was an illusion, and the control he believed he wielded was nothing but a lie.
Not again. Not ever again. The king's face turns steely. From this point on, he must be respected. He will not accept anything else than complete subordination to his word. Europe, gripped by chaos for so long, is crying out for a new order. Christian monarchs can survive only by standing together in common fealty to a strong overlord. And are there any better claimants than Sigismund of Hungary, son of the great Emperor Charles himself? Certainly not his older brother Wenceslaus, wastrel king of Bohemia.
One of the household knights snaps the king out of his bitter thoughts. "We must go, sire." One last look at the bloody battlefield, at the riderless horses running around in madness and confusion, butchered bodies strewn about everywhere. Then Sigismund, the ginger fox of Hungary, turns around and digs the spurs into his mount's flank.
There will be no heroic self-sacrifice, no dying for the cause. He will flee the slaughter. He will cross the Danube in a fisherman's boat to escape his pursuers. He needs to stay alive, to become an emperor, to unite all of Europe. He will leave the dying to others. My name is Vašek.
And I am Alžběta, and this is Bloody Heart of Europe. Sigismund was the second son of Charles of Luxembourg, the great emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, second not only in succession, but also in love and care. His half-brother Wenceslaus was in every way the preferred child. Charles tells us in his letters that his firstborn's coming was, quote, like the rising of the dawn that drives away the mist. No such grand words for Sigismund. No missives to the European ruling elite at all. No 4 kilograms of pure gold given to Aachen's cathedral as a token of gratitude. As the saying goes, Wenceslaus was the heir, Sigismund was the spare.
Sigismund may have been strictly secondary in the emperor's dynastic plans, but Charles was so influential and so highly respected that even his least favorite son got a huge chunk of the European pie. Sigismund became the king of 2 kingdoms at once, Poland and Hungary, 2 large countries to the east of the Holy Roman Empire. However, after Charles's death, things went awry very fast. The Polish nobles decided that they would rather crown the daughter of their previous king. Incidentally, her name was Jadwiga, and she would become one of the most famous monarchs in the history of Poland. But that's a different story. So, all that was left to the teenage Sigismund was Hungary, full of nobles nearly as rebellious as their Polish neighbors.
The young king's struggles for both his thrones are a complicated business. For now, it suffices to say that it wasn't an easy situation for a 16-year-old boy to handle. But he did handle it, managing to at least stabilize his affairs in Hungary. And during this time, he took every opportunity to learn and grow as a ruler. It's fair to say that both of Emperor Charles's sons endured difficult teenage years full of adversity. But while Wenceslaus slowly sank into apathy and uselessness, Sigismund emerged stronger and more ambitious than ever.
For proof of his shrewdness, we need to look no further than his catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Nicopolis, which opened this episode. The king was 28 years old and just lived through the worst day of his life. The victorious Turks massacred the Christian armies, and no crusade would ever truly threaten Muslim possessions in Europe again. Those who didn't die on the field were captured. Those who weren't captured fled in shame.
But only Sigismund could turn a crushing defeat into a PR victory. Instead of running back to Hungary, the king took the remnants of his army and jumped on a ship to Constantinople. The capital of the Byzantine Empire was, by this time, surrounded by Turkish forces. Upon arrival, Sigismund told anyone who would listen that he was there to secure an alliance with the emperor and to defend the city. While the rest of the world supposed he was probably dead on the field, he spent the next few weeks in the Byzantine capital and did no fighting whatsoever. But that didn't stop him from sending a triumphant letter to the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, claiming that he heroically saved Constantinople from the Turkish threat.
This was obviously a lie, since the Turks abandoned their blockade only 6 years later, but it showcases the king's Machiavellian nature, his willingness to do anything and everything in order to succeed. His ambition and lack of scruples would soon put him straight on a collision course with his half-brother Wenceslaus, the weak ruler of the Holy Roman Empire.
By this time, Wenceslaus's grasp on the imperial throne was quickly slipping away. Many German nobles were becoming increasingly furious with their king's indecisiveness and a lack of care for the realm. Wenceslaus showed no desire to govern at all, choosing instead to spend his time on the hunt and in the wine cellar. He was also prone to causing international outrage. You might remember his obsession with drowning people and him personally torturing captured priests with a flaming torch. All of this led to the revolt of the Bohemian League of Lords, in which the king was captured and, humiliatingly, forced to replace his closest advisors.
He was also no closer to solving the gravest issue plaguing the Holy Roman Empire at this time, the Papal Schism. Throughout Wenceslaus's reign, for various reasons, there were sometimes 2, sometimes even 3 competing popes at once. That's clearly a few too many popes for a smoothly functioning Catholic Church. And since the Church was the cornerstone of European feudal society, the damage being done to the whole of Christendom was considerable. The ideal person to bring order to the chaos would of course be the traditional protector of the papacy, the Holy Roman Emperor. But for 20 years, Wenceslaus did nothing.
The German noble's patience was finally exhausted a year after the Battle of Nicopolis. Fed up with Wenceslaus's inaction and strange outbursts, they sent him a threatening letter which basically read, "Change your ways, or we are going to change our king."
Wenceslaus's answer was to try and find new allies, and his gaze fell on the French. At this time, the Kingdom of France was ruled by Charles VI. Charles was plagued by a mental illness which manifested itself through bouts of psychosis. By the language of the time, the French king was insane. Wenceslaus set out on a journey to the city of Rheims, probably thinking he could out-negotiate King Charles and gain the support of his powerful country. At the very least, there was no chance of fresh scandals. After all, how wild would your behavior have to be to overshadow the whims of a madman?
Unfortunately, causing maximum embarrassment was a challenge King Wenceslaus was always up to. Straight after he arrived in Reims, he got so terribly drunk that for 3 days he couldn't even attend the feast prepared in his honor. Some minor agreements were signed, but in the end, Wenceslaus didn't accomplish any of his main goals, and he was still no closer to resolving the papal schism.
In summary, Wenceslaus's position within the empire was fragile. The German nobles were still angry, and many felt that a king of the Romans and a future Holy Roman Emperor should be someone more competent.
Sigismund watched his brother's pathetic attempts to keep his position with increasing worry. Both kings were members of the same ruling dynasty, and since they had no children, each other's heirs in case one of them died. Letting Wenceslaus lose the Roman crown would significantly decrease the power of the House of Luxembourg, and by extension, Sigismund.
He urged Wenceslaus to ride to Rome and have the Pope at last crown him the Holy Roman Emperor, the prestigious upgrade to the title of the Roman king. But as usual, when it came to Wenceslaus, he ignored good advice and stayed at home instead.
So, the inevitable happened. 5 of the 7 prince-electors, the nobles with the power to select the king of the Romans, decided to strip Wenceslaus of his title. Instead, they chose one of their own for the new ruler, Rupert III of the Palatinate. Among the reasons was the fact that the deposed king was, quote, useless, lazy, and completely unfit for the Roman Empire, end quote. Not something Wenceslaus would put on his resume, to be sure. He was, by the way, invited to the negotiations. He elected not to come.
Wenceslaus didn't take the news well. According to sources, the messenger who brought him the letter almost didn't survive the experience. Wenceslaus exploded into a murderous rage and ordered his underlings to execute the poor man. How else than by drowning? It took the combined efforts of his courtiers to dissuade him from the idea.
The king then declared his intention to travel to Germany and solve everything. But as always, when faced with a difficult task, he soon changed his mind and decided to do nothing instead. All of his future limp efforts to save his crown went nowhere as well. He was still the king of Bohemia, but he would never again sit on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire.
Sigismund must have been exasperated. He watched his brother, the favored child, the chosen heir, slowly throw everything away through weakness and incompetence. Yes, Wenceslaus hadn't had it easy, but neither did Sigismund. And while his older brother sank deeper and deeper into lethargy, Sigismund thrived, and every challenge he overcame made him a better ruler.
We have no surviving documents detailing what went through Sigismund's head, but you can clearly sense his anger in the way he acted afterwards. When Wenceslaus sent missives to his brother asking for help, Sigismund simply ignored them. The silence was so threatening that Wenceslaus started to fear his brother could attack him and try to snatch Bohemia for himself. The king retreated to a castle in the countryside and fortified it to the best of his ability, convinced that Sigismund's army might be just around the corner.
When the brothers finally met in person after a month-long standoff, things went poorly. Sigismund agreed to help Wenceslaus with his problems in the empire on several conditions. First, Wenceslaus had to finance any military campaign himself. Second, he had to grant Sigismund huge territories in the east. And third, Sigismund was to be irrevocably declared his brother's heir in Bohemia.
The conditions were harsh, to say the least. But the way Wenceslaus reacted was wild. When he heard his brother's terms, he simply commanded his servants to prepare a horse. Then he mounted up and left without uttering a single word to his brother. Sigismund was confused for a moment and asked where his brother had gone. When the courtiers replied that the king had ridden off to the baths, Sigismund finally realized the truth. Wenceslaus wasn't going outside for a breath of fresh air to mull things over. This was a blatant insult, the rudest rejection imaginable. Now it was Sigismund's turn to explode with rage.
He made no rash decisions just yet, however. Instead, he patiently retreated back to the Kingdom of Hungary, dealt with his own issues, and waited for the right moment. Meanwhile, Wenceslaus tried to solve the problem of his lost Roman crown all on his own, and he, predictably, failed. In fact, he failed so spectacularly that he almost lost Bohemia as well, when the new Roman king Rupert arrived with an army. In the end, Wenceslaus was saved by his own nobles of the League of Lords, who helped him out, in exchange for more concessions, of course.
Wenceslaus was hopelessly out of his depth, and he must have known it. He had no powerful friends, no reliable allies. The only things left to him were the crown on his head and a terrible reputation across Europe.
This is when Sigismund swooped in with a bold idea for a new order in Bohemia. He offered his brother another deal. Wenceslaus could keep all his titles, call himself the King of the Romans and of Bohemia, live a life of prestige and luxury, and Sigismund? Well, he would take care of everything. He would assume the actual power in the Kingdom of Bohemia. He would make all the hard decisions. Wenceslaus would just stay silent and follow his lead.
This would be a preposterous proposition for most European monarchs of the day. To freely give up all your power, to abandon your duties and become a glorified puppet? Unthinkable, dishonorable. But Wenceslaus, being Wenceslaus, he agreed. The worn-out king promised Sigismund his complete loyalty and obedience in all matters regarding the Kingdom of Bohemia. He would continue to be the king, but in name only. The true power in all the lands under the Luxembourg dynasty now lay with Sigismund.
It was a move appreciated all around. The members of the League of Lords were happy with their new overlord. They saw him as a decisive ruler, a man of action, exactly what was needed after the utter chaos of the years before. Sigismund organized an assembly during which the Bohemian nobles had their grievances heard. Seeds of order, peace, and calm were being planted across the kingdom in disarray. Sigismund, unlike his older brother, never forgot his great father's vision for what Bohemia, the empire, and all of Europe should look like. And he was determined to make that vision a reality.
He might well have succeeded, but he had Wenceslaus for a brother, and Wenceslaus had a real knack for making poor decisions. The 40-year-old king of Bohemia grew restless in his impotence. He became irritated by the loss of his power and by what he perceived was a Sigismund talking down to him.
From Sigismund's letters, you can see why Wenceslaus would feel that way. The King of Hungary clearly saw his older brother as a naive, childish person who was better suited for patient, fatherly explanations rather than a debate of equals. For all we know, Sigismund's assessment was accurate. But Wenceslaus didn't like it, so he lashed out.
In clear violation of the previous agreement with his brother, Wenceslaus started interfering with the kingdom's affairs. He sabotaged Sigismund's attempts to seize a number of castles and even instructed his allies to oppose his younger brother at every opportunity.
Sigismund's patience with his brother's antics finally ran out, and when he snapped, his reaction was furious and decisive. He immediately ordered his men to place the king under arrest and pillage the royal court, seizing all the valuables, books, and documents. The shocked, unprepared king was easily captured and locked in Prague Castle with minimal fuss.
Sigismund's soldiers also attacked the residence of the royal chamberlain in order to kill him and loot the king's treasury. The man managed to escape, but a significant amount of gold and silver fell to Sigismund. The King of Hungary then appointed a new chamberlain who steeply raised taxes in royal towns and monasteries. The Prague Jews suffered as well. Sigismund triggered a pogrom, meant to further bolster his finances.
In short, he tried to rapidly consolidate his position because he knew the king's arrest would divide Bohemia and probably cause a civil war. But his actions were uncharacteristically rash, reminiscent of Wenceslaus's worst outbursts. He let himself be provoked into acting out of emotion as opposed to sound strategy. Instead of calming the situation, he inflamed it, to the point when armed conflict in Bohemia was inevitable.
So Sigismund came up with a cunning plan. He sent for Prokop's brother, Jošt of Moravia. The name might ring a bell. We talked about him in our previous episode as the relative of Wenceslaus, and a leading member of the League of Lords who rebelled against the king.
This ambitious nobleman now marched with an armed force towards Bezděz. But instead of besieging or storming the castle, they came to offer terms. Prokop and his men would be allowed to leave freely if they gave up the castle without a fight. To guarantee their freedom, they would receive an official letter of safe conduct, signed by King Sigismund himself.
Compared to facing the king's army in battle, this offer must have seemed quite generous. Perhaps suspiciously so. And sure enough, it was a ruse. Once the defenders left the safety of the walls, Prokop was immediately apprehended and thrown in jail. The king's letter and his word turned out to be worth less than the paper on which it was written.
Sigismund was probably very pleased with this outcome. One of the strongest castles in the realm taken without a fight, just through a little bit of treachery. But like many of Sigismund's cynical moves after the coup against Wenceslaus, it would have dire consequences.
While the king celebrated, his cousin Jošt was fuming. Sigismund used him as a tool in the ploy against Prokop. He captured Jošt's brother in the most dishonorable way. And to top it all off, Sigismund claimed it was Jošt who made the decision to break the terms. To shield himself from blame, he tarnished the honor of his commander.
This was too much for Jošt. Once Sigismund left the seemingly pacified country to attend to his royal duties in Hungary, rebellion erupted again, with unprecedented intensity. Now that the king was gone, many nobles, disaffected with the way Sigismund was ravaging Bohemia for his own gains, joined those still loyal to Wenceslaus. And when the rebels looked for a leader, Jošt stepped in. One of Sigismund's erstwhile servants turned into a bitter enemy, and the king had no one to blame but himself.
Sigismund's grand plans were unraveling with breakneck speed. He thought he would rein in King Wenceslaus and make him cooperate. Instead, he had to capture him and jail him. He thought he would bring peace and stability to Bohemia, and instead, he brought war. He thought he would add Bohemia to his growing power base, and instead, the locals openly rose against him.
With every step of the way, Sigismund's solutions were becoming more and more radical. When he heard about Jošt's rebellion, he decided on the most extreme act of all. He brought the Cumans to Bohemia.
If you have played the hit video game Kingdom Come Deliverance, this might ring a bell. For those of you who haven't, the Cumans were formerly nomadic people of Turkic origins who settled in Hungary several generations before Sigismund's time. Germans called them the Pale Ones or the Blonde Ones, and they were rightfully feared. There were brutal, efficient warriors capable of fast movements, wholesale slaughter, and indiscriminate pillaging. This is exactly why Sigismund brought them to Bohemia, and they did what was asked of them.
The Cumans quickly burned and murdered their way through the land. Some of their violent acts shocked the whole country, none more so than the sack of Gutenberg, the richest city in the kingdom. The rebellious nobles, including Jost, were cowed by this display and asked for a truce. But it was a short-term victory for the Hungarian king.
The Cumans' campaign forever destroyed Sigismund's reputation in Bohemia, not only among the nobles, but the general populace as well. During this time, he would become known as the quintessential villain, a treacherous, power-hungry killer. It earned him a new moniker, the Ginger Fox, after the cunning predator that kills without remorse. Any authority he hoped to wield in future would have to rest solely on fear, not sympathy.
King Sigismund had burned all the bridges behind him. The old family ties were broken. He imprisoned his brother and saw his cousins rebel against him. So there was only one path left for him to follow, that of intense ambition. If Wenceslaus didn't have the mettle to be the king of the Romans, Sigismund would. If the rest of the House of Luxembourg failed, he alone would carry it to glory.
He would get his opportunity soon. Rupert, the old king of the Holy Roman Empire, died. What does that mean for our story? Let's recap. Wenceslaus used to have 2 crowns. Due to his incompetence, he lost the throne of the Holy Roman Empire to Rupert. Of course, he still had 1 crown left. He ruled the smaller kingdom of Bohemia. But now all eyes turned to the more important imperial throne. It was suddenly vacant, and there had to be another king of the Romans, another ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. Someone completely new. Nobody in the empire wanted Wenceslaus back. So an election was needed.
It was difficult to predict who the electors would choose. As was so often the case, the nobles were disunited and couldn't come up with a single preferred candidate. The imperial crown was at one point even offered to Henry IV, the King of England, who immediately declined. In the end, the electors couldn't reconcile their differences. The majority of them elected one king, the rest chose a different one.
The 42-year-old Sigismund was the minority candidate, supported by 3 prince-electors, and he clearly lost. But what others might have taken as a decisive defeat, he considered an important step toward his ultimate goal. No, he technically didn't have the required majority, but if he called himself the king of the Romans anyway, who would stop him? He never put his foot off the gas, even presented with unfavorable circumstances. And he certainly wouldn't fret over the bizarre conditions of his election ceremony.
You see, the ceremony was supposed to take place in a church in Frankfurt, but there was a problem. One of Sigismund's enemies, the Archbishop of Mainz, placed an interdict on the church in question, essentially desanctifying it, in an attempt to stop the election. So the nobles, including Sigismund, got creative. They gathered behind the building and elected their new king on the holy grounds of the graveyard.
While all this was happening, Sigismund's opponent, supported by the majority of the empire's mightiest nobles, could calmly enjoy the ride, perhaps laughing at Sigismund's desperate attempts to make himself look legitimate. His name may surprise you, just as it certainly surprised Sigismund, Jost of Moravia, Sigismund's cousin and the leader of the rebellion in Bohemia.
It might sound a bit strange. Why did the German nobles grant the crown to a random Bohemian rebel? But remember, Jost was an important man in his own right. He was a cousin of 2 kings, a nephew of the great Emperor Charles. He didn't rule any kingdom himself, but he was a capable politician and a very smart man. and the royal blood running through his veins was thick enough to get him the top job.
Sigismund wasn't about to accept it, of course. So Europe suddenly had two rival kings of the Romans, two rulers of the empire, two members of the House of Luxembourg who were bitter enemies. Three, if we count the half-forgotten Wenceslaus. By this time, he was no longer Sigismund's prisoner. He managed to escape from the imprisonment in Vienna and slipped back to Bohemia in disguise. He certainly wasn't a relevant candidate for the imperial throne, even though, in his inimitable style, he called himself the King of the Romans until his death.
Meanwhile, another power struggle appeared to be brewing in the empire, one with significant implications for the civil war in Bohemia. What could Jošt do with his newfound authority? Could he challenge Sigismund and potentially seize control of Bohemia for himself?
We will never know. 4 months into his rule, Jošt suddenly died. It's not entirely clear why. The causes may have been natural, as Jošt was in his 60s. But it cannot be disputed that one specific person greatly benefited from his death. Sigismund lost a dangerous foe, and the electors, finding themselves short of viable candidates, finally gave him their unanimous support.
The empire's crown was his. He satisfied his ambition and would have made his late father proud. And what did it cost? Only his honor and the love of his subjects. He pillaged his homeland at the head of a foreign army. He fought, imprisoned, and perhaps murdered his relatives. A small price to pay for all his glorious achievements, wouldn't you say?
Sigismund got what he wanted. He would no longer need to deal with the petty disputes of the Bohemian nobles, to bother himself with the sorry excuse for a king who was his brother. He had the empire, and little Bohemia would slide beneath his notice.
Except it wouldn't. In the broken country, plundered and burned by Sigismund's Cumans, a country fed up with the old ways, something new was brewing. A radical movement, the likes of which Europe has never seen before. It was just waiting for a spark, which the king will duly provide when he murders their holy champion. And the heart of Europe will soon drip with blood.
Harsh words echo through the church in the German city of Constance.
We know that he is hardened in his wickedness and obstinate in heresy.
The gathered priests, their faces grim, stony, or furious, watch the object of their scorn intently. He is an unremarkable man in his 40s, clean-shaven, standing before them in priestly robes and holding a chalice.
He looks like he belongs. He seems to be one of them. But he isn't. He is their victim. And they are his killers.
They surround him and start stripping him of his holy vestments. For every removed piece of clothing, they add a vicious insult.
The man, however, remains calm, almost stoic. I trust in the Lord God Almighty, for whose name's sake I patiently endure this blasphemy, he says.
The crowd of priests only gets angrier. They roughly cut his hair and crown him with a tall paper hat.
There are images of 3 devils on it, along with damning words. This is an arch-heretic.
In the minds of those around him, the condemned is no longer a man of God.
We entrust this body to you, your majesty,
They call out. King Sigismund of the Holy Roman Empire, sitting nearby, looks disinterested. He lazily flicks his hand, and guards seize the former priest.
They don't even bother to bind his hands or feet. Why would they? Where would he run? He remains expressionless as they walk towards the city gates. The hot summer air buzzes with insects and the busy chatter of the townsfolk.
When the procession passes by the church cemetery where all his books are being burned, the prisoner offers a sad smile, nothing more.
It is only after they reach their destination, a meadow outside the city, that he finally loses his composure. He falls to his knees. "God have mercy on me," he cries.
The mocking paper hat falls from his head, but one of the guards quickly puts it back on. In front of them, there stands a solitary stake. There is no wood stuck beneath it yet, but the prisoner knows what it is. He is looking at his own pyre.
The guards strip him of his last pieces of clothing. He is bound to the stake, a crowd of people forming all around. The ropes are painfully digging into his skin. He cannot freely move his head because of the metal chain tightened around his neck. At last, they bring out the wood. Bundles of it are stacked around the bound man, reaching up to his chin.
All fall into silence.
"This is your last chance to withdraw your heresy and live,"
calls out the king's marshal.
"In the truth of the gospel, I joyfully desire to die today,"
answers the prisoner in a high-pitched voice, looking towards the heavens. With that, the marshal claps his hands, turns, and begins his ride back to the city.
Behind him, the wood catches fire.
The man now screaming at the stake will soon be dead. His ashes scattered in the river Rhine. Nothing will remain of him. No body parts his supporters could venerate as holy relics.
He must be utterly forgotten. No one in the ages to come will remember the heretic priest called Jan Hus.
But it's far too late for that. The ideas he has been preaching cannot be stopped anymore.
And the flame that snuffed out one man's life will soon spread to engulf the entire land.
My name is Vašek,
And I am Alžběta.
and this is Bloody Heart of Europe.
The city of Prague in the 1380s was a spectacular sight. Dozens of church spires reached for the sky, the result of the vast construction effort of Emperor Charles IV. The old emperor was dead now, but during the early reign of his son Wenceslaus, the growth continued unabated. It seemed that each day new buildings were springing from the ground.
The inhabitants were many, of a varied stock and creed. Apart from the Czechs, most of them were German, as had been the case for hundreds of years. Prague was also a center of learning and advancement, thanks to its famous university, founded by Charles several decades before. It is estimated that 1/5 of all people living in the city at the time were students.
Jan Hus was one such student. A teenage boy from the countryside, he must have been flabbergasted the first time he passed one of Prague's gates and found himself inside the great walls. Everything was new and unbelievably big. Prague had the largest market square in Europe. The almost completed monumental stone bridge over the Vltava River, a marvel of medieval engineering, connected Prague Castle with the rest of the sprawling city. There were taverns, brothels, and all kinds of other ways for a lively young man to spend his time and money.
Jan Hus, however, was poor, so he couldn't really afford a busy nightlife. Besides, he was there to study, not to have fun. His dreams weren't too ambitious. He wanted to become a priest, not because he felt a divine calling, but simply because he believed that the life of a clergyman was easy and comfortable.
In any case, for a boy such as him, anything would be better than to stay in his village. You see, Jan Hus was smart. He had a good memory and spoke excellent Latin. He read voraciously and composed religious songs. But his favorite pastime was playing chess. He was so fond of the game that years later, he expressed regret at how much time he wasted with it and how many friends he bothered asking for another match. A picture emerges of a bright, slightly socially awkward young man, not the best student in his class, but talented and motivated enough to survive in an unfamiliar environment.
The University of Prague was a whole new world for Hus. Just like today, students could enroll in local dormitories. It wasn't a place just for sleeping, but also for eating, learning, and having fun. It was the beating heart of university life. Of course, this did not apply to the wealthy. They attended the university only for the lectures, or simply had private tutors.
On the other hand, the company of young men from the middle and lower classes who stayed together for long days and evenings created a perfect breeding ground for the exchange of new ideas. The debates of the students who flocked there from far corners of Europe often centered on contemporary events, religion, and, above all, the social problems they faced in a troubled world.
In all this, Jan Hus thrived. He secured employment in Prague to support himself, dedicated enough time to his studies, and by his mid-20s, he earned a master's degree. As was often the case with him, his results were average. He ranked 10th among the 22 students in his class. He wasn't bothered by it, though. He could study at the university, enjoy life in Prague, and that was quite enough.
For all his later radical thoughts, Hus the student wasn't too enthusiastic when it came to the issues of the day. We have a source describing one of the students' debates at which Hus was present. The discussion, held in private confines of a burgher's house, focused on the murder of John of Nepomuk by King Wenceslaus of Bohemia and his cronies. You might remember this incident from our very first episode. The king captured a group of priests and had them tortured. One of them didn't survive, and the king's men dumped his body in the river.
It sparked international outrage, sullying Wenceslaus's name across the royal courts of Europe. Of course, the citizens of Prague also had their strong opinions about what should be done. At the debate Hus was a part of, some voices called for extremely harsh measures. There should be an interdict placed upon the city of Prague, they said. That would basically mean excommunicating the entire city and preventing any religious services from being performed there.
But Hus was having none of it. He said, quote, "You're making such a big deal of the arrest of a few little priests. Tell me why we should stop praising God." End quote. It seems ironic. The man who would soon become the firebrand preacher stirring up the masses urges calm and wants everyone to stay quiet. There was a long way to go from Hus the student to Hus the rebel.
The grand events of history moved on, regardless of what young Hus thought or believed, however. The turn of the 14th century came and went. King Wenceslaus lost the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. Bohemia was getting ready to tear itself apart in a civil war. Meanwhile, in the very first year of the new century, when Hus was about 30, he was finally ordained a priest.
At the time, the Catholic Church was in a difficult place. For 22 years, there have been 2 popes at the same time, one of them in Rome, the other in the French town of Avignon. The reasons were political, of course. The powerful kings of France wanted to have the head of the church at their disposal. That didn't mean that Avignon Pope was irrelevant outside of France, though. Support for one pope or the other was very fluid across Europe. One of them usually dominated for a time, then was overtaken by his rival.
We can take our usual suspect, King Wenceslaus, as an example. For a while, he was an ardent supporter of the Pope in Rome. That brought him into conflict with his own family, including the formidable Jost of Moravia, who preferred the French Pope. Then Wenceslaus, after losing support across the empire, switched sides in hopes of finding help outside his borders. It didn't lead anywhere. So, a decade later, the king threw his weight behind a third pope, a newcomer residing in the Italian city of Pisa.
Long story short, institutional chaos reigned supreme within the church. Nobody could agree on what to believe, how to interpret the scripture, or what rules to set for ordinary Christian folk. This led to excesses among the priesthood as well. You might recall that Jan Hus wanted to become a priest chiefly so that he could live a comfortable life. With many priests, however, a comfortable life would be a gross understatement of the true decadent reality. They used the money collected from believers to feast, get drunk, and seek certain other pleasures of the flesh. The vow of celibacy be damned. It was difficult for those higher up to rein them in, even if they had the appetite to do so, instead of scheming against each other in their unceasing struggle for the papacy.
Our sources tell of many egregious incidents, some of them truly remarkable. In Prague, for example, a priest by the name of Nicholas was arrested and burned alive for sleeping with prostitutes. It seems quite a harsh punishment, until you read on and realize that Nicholas financed his little misadventure by robbing a nearby church.
Not every priest was willing to stand by and remain silent. One man in particular deeply influenced Jan Hus and many other religious thinkers. He was an Englishman by the name of John Wycliffe. His treatises criticizing the circumstances within the church were immediately denounced and banned in England. But some copies found their way to Prague and to the hands of Hus.
Remarkably, there survives a version of Wycliffe's text copied by young Master Hus. His own notes and comments are recorded in the margins, indicating that the book had a profound influence on him. The annotations have a tone of astonished admiration, calling Wycliffe a hero and wishing him entrance into the kingdom of heaven. The carefree student from years gone by is also still perceivable. One of Hus's notes reads simply, "Ha ha."
Jan Hus wasn't the only one whose worldview has been shaken by Wycliffe's ideas. The copies quickly spread throughout Charles University and caused quite a stir among the students. Factions quickly arose, some in support of Wycliffe's opinions, some arguing against what they called heresy.
Interestingly, the factions were divided roughly among national lines. The Czech students mainly supported Wycliffe. The German ones, of whom there were many, generally stood against his ideas. It is hard to tell why exactly the teachings of this English philosopher became so connected to the cultural identity of the Czech people, but Jan Hus clearly wasn't immune to this discord. After all, one of his notes in Wycliffe's copied manuscript calls for the Germans to go home.
This national divide manifested itself beyond the confines of the university as well. Around this time, in the early 1400s, the conflict between the Luxembourg brothers escalated and cut the kingdom of Bohemia apart. You may recall from our last episode that Sigismund's Cuman armies sacked the country while King Wenceslaus was in captivity.
As the rich and powerful took sides, the common people did the same. Most of the Czechs stood behind Wenceslaus, who, although weak and ineffective, was still their lawful king. The Germans, on the other hand, supported Sigismund's invasion and power grab.
This only added to the confused division of Bohemian society.
Against the backdrop of political upheaval in the kingdom and chaos in the church, Jan Hus slowly began his rise to prominence. He started preaching in a simple church, the Bethlehem Chapel, which would soon become known as the place to attend unconventional masses in the Czech language. In other churches across the city, it was much more common to celebrate Mass in Latin or German. But it wasn't just a question of language. Hus weaved Wycliffe's radical ideas into his sermons, criticizing the church and especially the bad apples among the priesthood.
Hus was far from alone in his criticisms. In the beginning, he was supported in his efforts by a very important personality, the Archbishop of Prague himself. Zbigněk Zajíc of Hasenberg was a former knight who used to be a military advisor to the king. After he embarked on a career in the clergy, he identified many of the same problems as Hus. So, while Wycliffe's ideas and opinions were being banned across Europe, Hus was safe, protected by the Archbishop from any repercussions.
This was precisely what he needed to let his worldview flourish. The former Jan Hus, once a carefree student indifferent to the murder of John of Nepomuk and merely desiring a peaceful, comfortable life, was gradually being replaced by a very different man. He found something worth fighting for.
So, what was it exactly? What did he, the Archbishop, and other like-minded priests want? Well, we've already talked about the fact that many priests have been guilty of less than holy behavior. It is telling that Archbishop Zbigněk felt the need to ban the clergy in the capital from gambling, spending time in pubs, and wearing overly luxurious robes.
But cracking down on rowdy clerics was far from the only item on Hus's agenda. Another thing he struggled against was fake miracles. An increasing number of priests were trying to draw crowds, and thus money, to their churches by feigning miraculous acts of God. Picture today's televangelist in the United States, and you get the idea of what it was like. To combat this, the Archbishop established a committee, which included Hus, to investigate these phenomena. Of course, in many cases, the supposed miracles were exposed as fraudulent tricks.
There was another conflict as well, much more serious in its consequences than a few deacons playing cards and some fake miracles. It was centered around the practice of selling indulgences. For the past few hundred years, the church used a new way to make a lot of money. If a person committed a sin, they could simply pay up and buy their way out of the fires of hell. The funds were then used to finance crusades or build new cathedrals, but a lot of wealth also found its way to the pockets of the priests. During Hus's time, it was completely normal for rich nobles and ordinary people both to give their earnings to the church as penance.
Jan Hus didn't like the practice at all. In fact, he had something of a personal ordeal associated with it. When he was still young, a poor student, he spent his very last coins to purchase an indulgence for himself. He couldn't even buy food afterwards. The memory of him starving while his money filled the endless coffers of the church was clearly meaningful to him. He mentioned it years later during his preaching. Hus was arguing that indulgences should be scrapped altogether. In his eyes, the only power that could grant forgiveness to sinners was God.
Unfortunately for Hus, it was one thing coming after individual priests. It was quite another trying to knock down one of the central pillars of the church's income. And Hus didn't stop there. Relying on the teachings of Wycliffe, he began to question the authority of the Pope.
Wycliffe thought that the church was not necessarily represented by the Holy See. The true head of the church was Jesus Christ, after all. So, if the Pope and his underlings didn't lead virtuous lives, Christians were under no obligation to listen to them. In fact, if the Pope and his prelates strayed from the path, they would become, quote, a congregation of Satan led by an Antichrist.
This was risky from Hus. When you go after the head of the church, you can't be shocked when it comes back to bite you. Soon enough, Pope Benedict XIII declared that heresy was ravaging the Kingdom of Bohemia. Unless the followers of Wycliffe changed their ways, they would soon lose their offices and inheritance, as well as be obliged to pay hefty fines to the church.
But there's a wild card in this story, the ever-unpredictable King Wenceslaus. He finally returned from being imprisoned by his brother, and instead of enjoying deserved peace, he suddenly had to deal with the Pope criticizing him for heresy in front of the European courts.
Other kings would probably swiftly punish every rebel in reach and consider the matter closed. But Wenceslaus had other plans. You see, for all the troubles they caused, the King of Bohemia still found Hus's ideas enticing. He didn't particularly like neither the Pope nor his church. What's more, even the king's wife and some of his noble friends were sympathetic to Hus's cause.
So, Wenceslaus decided on a half measure. He forced the Archbishop of Prague to write a statement along the lines of, "There is no heresy in the Kingdom of Bohemia, therefore there is no problem." It was a somewhat lazy solution. The king basically just closed his eyes and pretended he didn't see the spreading fire. And, surprisingly, it worked, at least for a short time. But in the making of this fragile peace, a new rift has emerged. This time between Hus and his powerful patron, the Archbishop of Prague.
Archbishop Zbigniew found himself in a precarious situation. At first, he may have liked Hus, as both men wanted to change the unacceptable behavior of some of the clerics. Now, Hus was making Zbigniew's life horrendously difficult. After each of Hus's passionate, revolutionary sermons, the Archbishop was caught between the wishes of the king on one side and the Pope on the other.
By papal command, Zbigniew was supposed to root out Wycliffe's ideas. But how could he move against the heretics if, according to the king, there were no heretics in Bohemia? And all the while, the teachings of Wycliffe loudly echoed through the Bethlehem chapel. This could not go on. Hus may have not realized it yet, but he had lost an important ally, and soon he would lose another.
Before we get there, we must return to the troubles in the highest echelons of the Catholic Church. In the year 1409, the papal schism was going on for more than 30 years. Two popes, one in Rome and the other in the French city of Avignon, constantly bickered and competed for supremacy. Each had their own cardinals. Each had supporters among both the clergy and the nobility.
It seemed nothing could resolve this eternal standoff. But that year, many cardinals of both popes decided they had enough. They called a council in the Italian city of Pisa. And there, under the shadow of the famous Leaning Tower, they elected a new pope to finally end the schism. Welcome, Pope Alexander, the newest Holy Father on the European stage.
It may come as a shock to you, but electing yet another pope didn't solve anything. The other popes weren't about to resign just because another guy in a fancy hat showed up. It just meant that from now on, there were 3 popes vying for power instead of 2. The papacy of Pisa would continue alongside those in Rome and Avignon. Jan Hus condemned indulgences, so we're offering something even better. While we can't guarantee you a spot in heaven, we can provide exclusive bonus episodes packed with all the stories that didn't make it into the main episode. Start listening for free, and for the full truth, Spare a groschen or two at the Bloody Heart of Europe Patreon page.
Pope Alexander of Pisa didn't enjoy his new job for very long. He died soon after his election, but John XXIII, his successor, was determined to continue the struggle against the other popes. And things got insane fast. Pope John decided that the best way to assert his authority would be to call a crusade against the King of Naples, a chief supporter of the Pope in Rome. The war was not only a pretty unhinged solution to restoring peace in Europe, it would also require vast sums of money. So, John turned to the true and tested method of generating funds: selling indulgences.
Unfortunately for him, he ran into a problem. He couldn't start selling indulgences without the permission of the local rulers. But many monarchs weren't too keen on letting him raise money for a military expedition against another Christian kingdom. He needed an ally who would give him a green light. And he found one. Can you guess who was opportunistic and spineless enough to do it? Everyone who said King Wenceslaus of Bohemia wins.
What would Wenceslaus get out of it? Well, his old claim to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire was being constantly ignored by both Rome and Avignon. The imperial crown was being fought over by Wenceslaus's relatives, Jošt and Sigismund. For most of the powerful people in the empire, the King of Bohemia became an afterthought. So when he saw a potential new ally, he pounced. He and the Pope in Pisa would help each other out. In exchange for the Pope's support, the king would let him organize a massive campaign of selling indulgences in Bohemia.
The Pope wasn't very subtle about it. His agents put giant chests in 3 Prague churches meant to be filled with coins. Then they started pounding drums, inviting the townsfolk to spend their way out of sin. This in a city already on edge because of the church's supposed avarice and greed.
Jan Hus, together with his supporters, was furious. It didn't take long for Prague to be gripped with turmoil, the streets full of angry protesters. They were mainly young people, university students, and apprentices, singing songs insulting the Pope's collectors. At the end of one of their marches, they theatrically burned mock papal edicts.
It was only a matter of time before things turned violent. During another protest, 3 young men were arrested and brought to the town hall. When Jan Hus heard about this, he went to the town hall to personally plead for the young men's freedom. He was given assurances by the councillors that nothing bad would happen to the prisoners. Soon after he left, however, and without a proper trial, the young men were executed.
This incident shocked Jan Hus to the core. He felt personally responsible for the waste of 3 young lives. He knew it was his rhetoric that sent them to the streets. He finally saw the very real, palpable impact of his actions and realized how dangerous a game he was playing.
It sparked an intense crisis within Hus. While droves of rebellious townsfolk carried the dead bodies of their new martyrs towards the Bethlehem chapel, the women dipping their napkins in the sacred blood of the slain, their leader stayed silent. He made no speech, tried to spark no further riots. Instead, he spent his time alone, probably contemplating his guilty conscience. The fact that he was actually responsible for the lives of other human beings. This was no academic debate anymore, no friendly dispute between fellow Christians. No, what was happening in Prague strayed uncomfortably close to an uprising.
Hus knew he couldn't hide forever. Beyond his windows, he could hear the people calling his name, urging him to share his wisdom with them. So he did. After a couple of weeks of self-imposed silence, he emerged on the political scene again, still not as a revolutionary figure with a holy sword in his hand, though. Hus was, in many ways, a careful, peaceful man. And even now he dressed his criticisms of the church as suggestions, topics to be calmly discussed without violence and bloodshed. But the city was too feverish and angry for that. Hus set in motion something vicious, and now he was unable to stop it.
King Wenceslaus, meanwhile, was observing the events in his capital with increasing worry and very likely a sense of betrayal. He shielded the reformers from the Pope's attention. Hus and his ilk should be grateful to him. Instead, they do what? Stir up trouble in the very streets of Prague? Force the town's councillors to take the harshest of measures? After his confident declarations, the king would now look like an utter fool.
Wenceslaus had enough, and he would soon get an opportunity to demonstrate it. The Pope announced that Jan Hus was placed under an interdict, basically excommunicating him from the Catholic Church. It was a big deal and a dangerous development for Hus and his followers, but the king showed absolutely no appetite to defend the rebellious preacher. Neither did any of Hus's other erstwhile protectors, for that matter. Overnight, the most popular priest in Prague became a toxic personality.
That was exactly the Church's aim. The papal interdict was a ruthless way to isolate you from your community. The excommunication didn't apply just to you, but also to everything and everyone around you. From now on, wherever Hus went, no religious ceremonies could be performed, not even weddings, baptisms, or funerals. It was as if Master Jan was surrounded by a strange bubble of faithless void.
Such a drastic blow would break many people's resolve. Hus could have bowed to the pressure. He might have recanted his views. There was still a way back for him. But he didn't. Now, at the crossroads of his life, he chose a different path. He knew he couldn't stay in Prague any longer, not with the interdict hanging above his head and dangerous enemies at every corner. So he left for voluntary exile.
At this point, Jan Hus practically vanishes from the history books. Only a few people knew where he went, but he never stopped working. He visited his friends in the countryside and continued to preach among the peasantry, walking from cottage to cottage, from field to field, like an apostle of old. This was done in open defiance of the interdict. But outside of the big cities, barely anyone cared.
Hus spread dangerous ideas wherever he went. He called for a new translation of the Bible so that the common people could better understand their faith. Not only that, he believed that the people themselves could be their own preachers, that any good Christian was fit to interpret the scripture.
The rumors of Hus's continued activity slowly trickled back to the capital. A year later, his own faculty at the university in Prague officially called him a heretic. But while his powerful enemies multiplied, so did his friends and allies. And not only among the nobility, but also the lower and middle classes. You see, it wasn't just a question of faith, but also social hierarchy. There was something deeply seductive in the idea that the common people could do just fine without constant interventions from priests and nobles. And so both the poor and the not very rich flocked under Hus's metaphorical banner.
It's somewhat ironic then that the man himself clearly wasn't as revolutionary-minded as some of his followers. Hus was no hardcore communist. Unlike many of the most radical elements in his growing coalition, he believed that a noble lord should be obeyed, if he stayed virtuous, of course. These small distinctions didn't really matter in the eyes of the enemies, though. He, together with his people, was clearly a threat.
In the year 1414, 2 years after Hus began his exile, the response finally came, even though at first glance it had nothing to do with him or his followers. a great council was called to the German city of Constance. The man who organized it was our old friend, the ginger fox, King Sigismund of Hungary. He's been the king of the Holy Roman Empire for 4 years now, and he felt the time was right to solve the thorniest issue of the day, the Papal Schism.
Why did he care so much? Well, ever since his fateful defeat at the Battle of Nicopolis, Sigismund had been dreaming about a united Europe. To achieve that, the Catholic Church had to be united first. It had to have a single head. Not only that, Europe needed a single interpretation of the scripture.
It was this second point that made Hus relevant to the council. He, along with various other heretics across the continent, preached a different way of thinking about God and the Bible. So, he was invited to speak before the council.
Jan Hus said yes to the invitation. It might seem utterly bizarre in retrospect. Why would he ever agree to travel into the midst of all of his enemies, knowing he would be at their mercy the second he stepped foot in Constance?
The answer lies in 2 parts. First, Hus genuinely thought he could convince the others by the power of his arguments. If the aim was to reach a consensus, a common interpretation of the Word of God, he wanted to influence the outcome. This was an opportunity to finally get rid of the interdict, to explain himself, and to make the world accept that he was not in fact a heretic, but a faithful Christian.
For the second reason Hus agreed to attend, we must return to King Sigismund of Hungary. He wanted the heretics to be there and convince them to stop their disturbances. But he also knew the thought of coming to Constance might make them nervous. So he provided Hus with a letter of safe conduct. The document was clear. No one was to harm the priest on his way to the council, unless they wanted to provoke the wrath of the king.
For Hus, this was an attractive proposition. Not only would he be allowed to defend himself and shape the future of Christianity, he would be completely safe while doing so. So, he packed his things and set out, accompanied by 30 friends, not knowing he was walking directly into a trap.
When Hus arrived in Constance, the city was buzzing with activity. The rich and the powerful, with their traveling parties, were followed by flocks of traders and craftsmen from all around the country. Among the new arrivals were dozens of money changers and bankers, hundreds of bakers and barbers. Inside the city walls, there were barely any accommodations available, and their prices were eye-watering. Even though Hus borrowed some money prior to setting out, he couldn't afford to rent a space for both himself and his companions. In the end, only Hus and 1 friend stayed in Constance. The rest left for the countryside around the city.
The uproar continued to build, but the principal host, King Sigismund, was nowhere to be seen. Hus was instructed to wait for the king's arrival. For about a month, he spent his time walking around the city, visiting the sights, and complaining to his friends how expensive everything was.
Soon, the lack of funds would be the least of his problems. After lunch one day, there was a knock on the door of his quarters. 2 cardinals were standing in the corridor, telling Hus that he had been invited to speak with their colleagues. The second he stepped outside the house, he was seized by a group of guards, dragged in front of the Pope, and thrown in jail on his orders.
This seems like a pretty clear violation of the safe conduct promised by King Sigismund. Unfortunately for Hus, his safety was guaranteed by a man who was more than accustomed to breaking his own word. In our previous episode, we mentioned the fall of the Bezdies castle. Back then, Sigismund lured his enemies outside the walls under the promise of safety, only to have them immediately arrested. The same thing happened to Hus.
From the very beginning, Sigismund had no intention of shielding him from harm. The only thing he needed was to get him to Constance and either make him recant his heresy or eliminate him. When Hus and his friends protested against the arrest, invoking the king's protection, the explanations they got were as laughable as those provided to the Bezděz garrison.
You see, the king couldn't protect anyone since he wasn't present in the city at the time of Master Jan's arrest. And when he finally arrived, the deed was already done. Sorry, it's out of His Majesty's hands. Plus, the accusation came from the church, and the king obviously can't meddle in the church's affairs. And anyway, the letter promised safe passage to the city, but it said nothing about the stay in the city itself. Master Jan should have read the fine print.
Jan Hus spent 4 months in the city jail. Why didn't he stand trial earlier? Well, let's say the council's proceedings were not going smoothly. Constance was host to 3 different popes, each a product of the schism, all vying for power and influence. One pope, fearing he might lose his seat during the deliberations, decided to flee. Disguised as a common servant, he escaped the city. Not exactly the most dignified exit for the head of Christendom on earth. For a time, the council members focused all their efforts on tracking him down, bringing him back, and officially stripping him of his title. Understandably, dealing with a single Czech heretic was low on their list of priorities.
All the same, Hus's time inevitably came. And when it did, his own people were responsible. Amidst the chaos of the council, a Czech priest from Prague called Jan Hus, an opponent of Hus, decided to expedite the process. He approached the assembled dignitaries and began to spin wild stories. Apparently, the situation in the Kingdom of Bohemia was nothing short of anarchy. Priests were being murdered in the streets without consequence. The common folk administered their own Holy Communion. What's even worse, one of the people performing the religious services was a woman. In short, Jan Hus led an aggressive, dangerous mob of heretics that threatened to uproot the very foundations of decent Christian society.
The authorities finally listened. Despite the protest of some Bohemian noblemen still sympathetic to Hus, the date was set for a hearing to begin. While the issue of Hus's heresy was, geographically speaking, confined within the borders of the Kingdom of Bohemia, the committee had a distinctly international feel. The priests who were to judge Hus came from Italy, France, England, and Germany, and rather than impartial arbiters, they quickly revealed themselves to be Hus's enemies.
Since the very start, the process was a farce. Whenever Hus tried to string more than a few sentences together, he was shouted down. But staying silent produced an equally hostile response. Throughout the several days it took the jury to reach their verdict, the truth of the matter was becoming more and more apparent. This was never meant to be a discussion, an opportunity to reach a compromise, to agree on the fundamentals of what it meant to be a Catholic priest and a Christian. This was a sham trial in which the defendant wasn't even allowed to freely speak.
The accusers came prepared. They presented every controversial opinion Hus had said or written, and they tried to engineer as much outrage as possible. It wasn't that difficult. After all, the audience was full of priests. So, of course, they didn't take kindly to listening to one of Hus's texts, claiming that many of them resemble evil scoundrels and villains, rather than Christ's apostles. In another treatise, Master Jan likened contemporary Christian priesthood to Pharisees, the murderers of Jesus.
And then there was the situation with the king. The great Sigismund of Hungary, the patron of the whole event, finally arrived in the city, and he decided that he would personally attend the hearing. But if Hus dared to hope the king was there to finally offer him the promised protection, he was sorely mistaken. Sigismund wasn't even angry or hateful. He spent the majority of the trial apparently bored out of his mind, just waiting for the inevitable conclusion.
At one point, the priests quoted Hus as saying, "A pope, a bishop, or a prelate living in deadly sin is no pope, bishop, or prelate at all." Shocking indeed, but Hus didn't stop there. In the writings presented at the trial, he extended this principle to kings and princes, essentially arguing that if rulers were morally corrupt, they shouldn't be allowed to wear the crown.
Such an inflammatory statement would undoubtedly anger many monarchs of the day. However, when the assembled priests asked Sigismund what he thought about this audacity, they could barely get his attention. He was in the middle of a conversation, speaking through a window with some fellow nobleman. When Hus's statement was repeated, Sigismund, seemingly unfazed, calmly responded, "No one lives without sin, Jan Hus," a reaction of a man who knew what was about to happen.
By then, even Hus knew the process wouldn't be fair. But the outcome remained uncertain. It wasn't merely about determining whether he was a heretic or not. Hus found himself in the midst of a delicate political situation. Neither the king nor the church wanted to execute this Bohemian upstart, knowing that doing so could lead to serious repercussions. Hus was popular among the common folk and held in esteem by a significant portion of the nobility. Making him a martyr could have far-reaching consequences.
So they offered him a deal. "Swear that your previous beliefs were heretical, and we shall be merciful. Refuse, and the process will continue. But then we might find that your heresy runs even deeper than we thought."
Hus refused, despite being tired, shaking, and racked with fever. The choice became clear to him. He now understood the fate that awaited him if he refused to cooperate. Yet, death was less terrifying to him than the prospect of eternal damnation. From his perspective, he could either accept the terms and save his body, or refuse them and save his soul. So, no matter how many times they asked, his answer remained the same. He believed he was right, and he believed they were wrong. He wished he could convince them of his truth, but if they wouldn't listen, there was nothing more to be said.
The last day of the process finally came. It started with a mass and continued with an uninterrupted reading of the accusations against Hus. He wished to speak in his defense, but was promptly silenced. Witness statements were read aloud, again without any chance for him to respond. When Hus protested, he was told the tribunal had heard enough from him already.
There was only one thing Hus would be permitted to say. If he finally saw reason and wished to recant his beliefs, there was still a chance. This was his very last opportunity before the verdict. Would he heed the advice of the wise people urging him to submit? What final words would he give the court?
Master Jan Hus said, "Even if the whole world tells me so, I cannot betray my conscience." With that, he was doomed.
The sentence came swiftly. Death at the stake. They stripped Hus of his vestments, put the mocking hat of an arch-heretic on his head, and hauled him outside the city walls. There, on the field of his execution, Hus was given one last chance to give up his beliefs in exchange for his life. And for the last time, he refused.
The fire went up quickly and consumed wood, flesh, and bone alike. Soon, the only thing bound at the stake was the charred remains of a headless torso. But even that wouldn't do. A misguided heretic must leave nothing for his followers to venerate. So, the bailiffs, with wooden clubs in their hands, smashed whatever was left of Hus. They found the head and shattered it to pieces. They found the heart and impaled it on a stick. With that gruesome spectacle, the church dignitaries were certain that was the last they heard of this meddlesome Czech rebel.
The happiest person in the city was King Sigismund of Hungary. His council, fleeing popes notwithstanding, was a resounding success. The papal schism was finally more or less resolved. One of the popes abdicated in return for a comfortable job as a top cardinal. Another ran away to Spain and faded from relevance. The third was found guilty of heresy, corruption, and immoral behavior, more specifically of piracy, sodomy, rape, incest, and murder. So nothing stood in the way of electing a single new pope, Martin V, that everyone agreed on.
Whatever we might think about the wild process that led there, the Church was suddenly united more firmly than ever before in living memory. The prestige associated with this achievement made Sigismund a European superstar.
And one would almost forget, Sigismund at last dealt with the inconvenient heretical troubles brewing in the Kingdom of Bohemia. If the movement tried to cause any more trouble, they would be easily crushed. Who knows, without their precious leader, it might disintegrate all on its own.
It didn't. On the contrary, the movement grew fast on the ashes of Master Jan Hus. A great war was coming. Sigismund will be an old man by the time it ends. And he will be long dead by the time the empire will finally know peace.
The young man nervously grips the hilt of his rusty sword. Despite the fresh air of an early morning, he is drenched with sweat.
He shuffles about, bumping into the people all around him. The crowd that has gathered in the chapel is huge, full of anonymous faces. Serfs, laborers, tradesmen, students, apprentices, even royal courtiers.
There's an air of expectancy. The man can taste it on his tongue. Prague is getting ready.
The man is no legendary hero.
He has a name, but it isn't important. He has a profession, but no one will remember what it was. He is a nobody.
But what he and his comrades do today will change the course of history.
He runs his hand over the sword again. It feels strange to hold its weight within the sacred walls of a church. Normally forbidden, of course, but the priest had been very clear during the secret meeting after last week's Mass. The weapons will be needed for what's coming.
Look, there's the priest now, climbing the steps to the unfinished pulpit. Master Jan Želivský, a fierce follower to the great martyr Jan Hus.
He begins to speak, his voice steady at first, but soon growing louder, rising to a shout, and then a full-throated yell.
The man with the sword doesn't really listen, though. His ears are humming, his mouth is dry. He knows exactly what the message is.
Rise up, brothers and sisters. The time is now. Take up your arms. March on the town hall. And if anyone dares to stand against us, kill them.
The man glances around, catching the glint of steel from swords and spears, and the fierce determination in the eyes of his fellow conspirators.
But first, they must perform a sacred ritual, consuming the body of Christ and drinking his blood. Only this act will grant them the strength and absolution they need for what they're about to do.
Once the communion is completed, the people spill out into the street. Leading them is the priest Želivský, holding a holy monstrance with the sacramental bread inside, as if it were a war banner.
He marches at the front of his ragtag army, guiding them towards the seat of power. As the mob surrounds the city hall, an eerie, frightening silence falls over them. The man with the sword stands at the forefront, eyes fixed on the great locked doors.
Inside, fellow dissidents are imprisoned, arrested during a previous protest. Master Jan's voice cuts through the stillness.
Let our people go.
He commands the king's counselors inside.
Release them, and no one needs to get hurt.
For several tense moments, nothing happens. Then, all at once, chaos erupts. The crowd, howling with rage, surges forward, battering the gate until it gives way.
The man with the sword is among them, certain that something has triggered the violence. Did someone throw a stone from the city hall windows? Did Želivský give the order to attack?
It doesn't matter now. The gate is down, and there's no turning back, only forward, up the stairs and into the second-story room where the councillors have gathered.
They are unarmed and terrified. There's nowhere to run. One of them, the Lord Mayor Jan Podvinský, an older, seasoned gentleman, puts up his hands in a gesture of surrender.
The man strikes him in the mouth with the hilt of his sword. The Lord Mayor falls to the ground, stunned. Someone gestures towards a window. The man with the sword nods.
They grab the bleeding mayor by the ankles and drag him across the room. Then they hoist him up and, without hesitation, toss him out the window. With a sickening crunch, he hits the street below.
The poor councillor clearly isn't dead. He's groaning and writhing in pain. But not for long. The mass of people outside spills over his body like a wave.
They beat him ferociously, without mercy. When the crowd finally disperses, the dead Lord Mayor's body lies motionless on the ground. No way back.
The man with the sword mutters and inhales a shaky breath.
No way back. No way back. He turns towards the room and helps his friends with another councillor, then another, then another. Soon, 11 corpses are piled up beneath the windows, and every rebel prisoner still alive is liberated.
The crowd falls silent again. The man with the sword watches the priest Želivský as he speaks again, forbidding any looting or theft. Even the richly dressed councillors' bodies are to be left alone, untouched.
This is not murder, after all. This is justice.
The rebels act swiftly, immediately electing their own councillors to replace those just murdered. When mounted guardsmen arrive at the scene, their commander takes one look at the armed mob and promptly orders a retreat.
The daring uprising has worked, but it isn't over yet. The future of the rebellion remains uncertain, hinging on one person, King Wenceslaus of Bohemia. And so, the city holds its breath.
My name is Vašek.
And I am Alžběta, and this is Bloody Heart of Europe. You may have heard the word defenestration before. It's a term referring to throwing someone or something out of a window. It may seem bizarrely specific. We don't really have a unique word for climbing in through a window, so why should the other direction be any different? Well, the main difference is that defenestration has made history. Strangely enough, two of the most famous ones happened in Prague, and each of them directly triggered a devastating war.
In 1618, some 200 years after our story, a Protestant mob will chuck Catholic politicians out of the window and start the 30 Years' War. But let's turn our focus to a morning 2 centuries earlier, to the scene which opened our episode, to the First Defenestration of Prague.
The seemingly spontaneous, but probably well-planned murder of the king's councillors in the streets of the capital will shatter the status quo in Bohemia. Who was responsible? How and why did it happen? And to whose benefit? And why would the death of a few men precipitate a large-scale war across not only Bohemia, but all the neighboring countries as well?
For the answers, we need to rewind time 4 years back to the immediate aftermath of the death of Jan Hus in the German city of Constance. You may recall from our previous episode that Hus, the radical reformer and critic of the Catholic Church, was burnt at the stake for his beliefs.
This was done with the silent consent of Sigismund, the ambitious king of Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire, who had already alienated the population of Bohemia by invading at the head of a foreign army. And by killing Jan Hus, he turned a flickering flame into an unstoppable blaze. The movement, now known as the Hussites after their beloved preacher, wasn't going to disappear.
The uproar would come, but not right away. The supporters of Hus across the country were devastated by his execution, but also unsure about what to do next. Perhaps surprisingly, it wasn't the poor masses in Prague or Hus's rustic acolytes in the countryside who reacted first.
It was the nobility. A significant portion of Bohemian nobles liked Hus and his ideas. They too saw that the church was in many ways greedy and corrupt, and the killing of Hus dismayed them. So they gathered together in a meeting to decide on their best course of action.
There were hundreds of important men at the meeting, but one of them stood out from all the rest. Čeněk of Württemberg, the supreme burgrave of the Kingdom of Bohemia, and therefore the second man of the realm after the king. Čeněk had been a committed supporter of Jan Hus even before the events in Constance. During Hus's exile from Prague, Čeněk even offered him a place to stay at one of his castles.
Hus was now dead, but Čeněk wasn't going to simply accept it and move on. Instead, he initiated a response. Together with his friends and allies, he did something extraordinary, even if it may not sound like it at first. He penned a strongly worded letter of protest addressed to the council in Constance. 452 Bohemian nobles ratified it with their seal. Čeněk's seal was the first among them all.
To them, Jan Hus wasn't just an innocent man. He was someone who had pretty valid points about the church's corruption. The Council of Constance had no business executing him, just like they had no right to tell the people of Bohemia what to believe. As for punishing Hus's followers, well, the Bohemian nobles weren't having it, at least not until there was a new pope. In the meantime, any religious disputes would be sorted out by the learned men at Charles University in Prague. After all, the people of Bohemia could handle their own issues. They didn't need a bunch of out-of-touch foreigners who had never even been to their country telling them what to do.
This was a shocking thing to do, a revolutionary act in the context of Europe in the 1400s. The power of the Catholic Church was supposed to transcend any national and political boundaries. It was meant to be absolute, inviolable, and unifying. Čeněk of Württemberg, together with his allies, rejected this and basically said, This is our country, and we will decide what to do here.
With this, Čeněk made new enemies both abroad and at home. It's important to note that the Kingdom of Bohemia was never unified in its support for Hus and his ideas. There were still many people, great nobles among them, fiercely loyal to the Catholic Church. They didn't like to see such insolence towards the papacy. In answer, the Catholic nobles formed their own league, aiming to oppose the Hussites. And so, the kingdom stood at the precipice.
This heightened tension in the kingdom was dangerous, and everyone was getting nervous, apart from one man. Wenceslaus, the King of Bohemia. By now, he was 54 years old, long faded from European relevance, living in the shadow of his successful younger brother Sigismund.
But this new stalemate presented an excellent opportunity for him personally. For years, his authority had been weak, curtailed by the nobility. Indeed, in the past, the League of Lords rebelled against their king, captured him, and forced him into humiliating concessions. Now, the nobles were arguing amongst themselves and were in no position to bother him. Wenceslaus had one goal: to keep them busy. If nothing changed and no one won, the king would be more than happy with that. And if he could play one side against the other, even better.
Another reason for Wenceslaus not to do anything against the Hussites was that he actually liked them, at least the moderate wing of the movement. The king had long despised any form of religious fanaticism, so he wasn't too keen on the radicals. What's more, many of the king's close associates were Hussite supporters, chief among them his wife, Queen Sophia of Bavaria. She was so smitten by the new ideas that she had personally been to the Bethlehem chapel to see Jan Hus preaching.
Although Wenceslaus and his court did nothing to improve the brittle situation in the kingdom, it didn't immediately result in an all-out war. Instead, what came next was a series of escalating feuds. First, the Hussites took over a number of monasteries in the countryside. 2 of them even drowned an abbot. This wasn't wholly vengeance for Jan Hus either. The men simply held a previous grudge against the monks and decided to use the situation for their own benefit. This is telling. All across the country, many of the violent acts were shabbily justified by religion, while in reality happening for personal reasons.
Whatever the cause for violence, the Catholics responded in kind. A notable incident happened in Luxembourg, the richest city in the kingdom, famed for its silver mines. A party arrived in the city to collect taxes for the king, led by Sir Radzik Kobyla. Sir Radzik was a supporter of the Hussite movement, and he came as a representative of the king who did nothing to protect his Catholic subjects.
This was enough of a reason for the Catholic priests in the city to incite an angry mob against him. A large group of miners from the nearby silver mines gathered near an inn where Radzik and his retinue were staying. They forced their way inside the building and brutally massacred Radzik and his 12 followers. They cut their bodies into pieces and, in what seems to have become a theme for this episode, threw the body parts out of the window.
Not even the shocking murder of his tax collector could convince the king to act. Wenceslaus was more than willing to ignore even the most brutal crimes if it meant preserving the status quo. Yes, he was angry for a while, but after the Luxembourg councillors sent him a few bags of silver along with a message that they had executed 2 of the miners, Wenceslaus let it slide. The king's unwillingness to side with anybody would characterize the coming months.
The Catholic response wasn't limited to the grassroots. The church itself tried to intervene. Its leadership issued interdicts over Hussite-dominated cities and banned all church services there, even weddings and funerals. But it was a toothless solution. The Hussites had no reason to respect orders from Rome. Czeniec of Wartenberg was pretty clear in his letters to Constance. All matters of faith in Bohemia were to be handled by Bohemians themselves. So, the Hussites simply expelled the Catholic priests from their churches and replaced them with their own clergy.
You would expect that the wider European community would support the Bohemian Catholics. After all, these Hussites were clearly heretics, taking shots at the Pope and his closest associates. But surprisingly, no help was forthcoming, at least not right away. The Catholic leadership was too busy dealing with more pressing problems. They still had to resolve the papal schism, for example.
And Sigismund, the great protector of Catholicism, the enemy of heretics everywhere, surely he would do something to stop Czeniec and his rebels. Well, not really, since he was currently traveling Europe chasing a runaway pope. The only thing he found the time to do was to send a very angry letter. It turned out to be less devastating than he had probably hoped. "Stop, or I will come for you at the head of a holy crusade," was the gist of it. Czeniec and his friends didn't stop.
On the contrary, more than ever, they were determined to succeed. And the first step was to unite their views. Same as every movement throughout history that went against the established rules, the Hussites held many conflicting opinions. There were so many questions to answer. Do we like paintings in churches? Do we worship the saints? Do we pray for the dead? What about capital punishment? But nothing divided the early Hussites as much as the question of the communion under both kinds.
If you're not sure what it means, that's all right. Let's get an explanation from Jacob of Mies, a Hussite priest and one of the fiercest defenders of the practice. Jacob had actually been a classmate of Jan Hus at the university, and they soon became good friends. Like Hus, Jacob hated the excessive wealth and corruption within the church, but he also didn't like the way the Catholics served their holy mass. During the ceremony, ordinary churchgoers received only the bread, the body of Christ. The wine, his blood, was reserved for the priests.
Jacob thought this was unacceptable. Just another way for arrogant priests to elevate themselves above their flock. At earlier points in the history of Christianity, the common believers received both the bread and the wine. And if the original followers of Jesus did it this way, it was surely good enough for Jacob's contemporaries.
Jacob wasn't just inspired by the good old days, by the way. He also thought that the world would soon end, that the signs were undeniable. The Antichrist was at the doorstep, and all good Christians would have to stand against the evil he would bring. To fight such an enemy, the believers needed all the strength they could get, and only by eating God's body and drinking his blood would they gain enough power for the final battle.
The communion under both kinds was controversial among the Hussites. Even Hus himself had hesitated to endorse it, and for good reason. What Jacob proposed was a massive change to the Catholic holy rite. Many thought that there was no way the Pope and the rest of the Christian world could ever accept it. And if they didn't, then what? The majority of Hussites never wanted to create their own splinter church. They wanted to make the Catholic one better. So why would they preemptively sink any attempt at diplomacy for a sip of wine?
While the Hussites squabbled about the communion, one man looked at the ideological chaos with deep disapproval. Czeniec of Wartenberg was a seasoned politician, and he knew what the movement needed was absolute unity. They had more than enough enemies, both at home and abroad.
So the Supreme Burgrave came up with an unexpected idea. If we, the Hussites, can't decide amongst ourselves and aren't going to listen to the Pope, Why not turn to the University of Prague again? The professors were already the ones settling various religious disputes. Čeněk now asked them to write the rules which would unify all of the Hussites under a common set of ideas.
They agreed, and in the debates that followed, Jacob's side won. The communion under both kinds was declared to be an integral part of the Hussite cause, and so it would remain. In the following decades, the distinctive banner with the holy chalice would fly over many bloody battlefields.
The situation in Bohemia has now become completely unprecedented. Never before was the church as a central authority of the faith usurped by a university, an institution with no direct connection to the usual structures of Catholic establishment. And instead of being subservient to the Pope, the university mostly worked with and for the Bohemian nobility. Čeněk and the rest of the Hussite nobles suddenly became extraordinarily powerful. They could easily influence not only secular matters, but also spiritual ones, such as who could serve as a priest and who could not.
Čeněk soon demonstrated his newfound power. He decided that more Hussite priests were needed, and that to make them seem more legitimate, especially in the eyes of the conservatives, they should be consecrated by a prominent Catholic priest. So, he kidnapped a Catholic bishop named Herman and imprisoned him at one of his castles.
Unsurprisingly, Bishop Herman didn't take kindly to the demands of his abductor, but Čeněk was unfazed. Perhaps drawing inspiration from his overlord, King Wenceslaus, he had Herman tortured until he submitted. In doing so, Čeněk ensured a steady flow of reformist priests, who were technically speaking sanctioned by the church itself.
It seemed like the Hussites were winning. Their position in Bohemia was getting stronger by the day. They even started to dream of convincing the Catholic hierarchy to accept their new ideas as a solution to the church's ongoing crisis. Then, the word of Hus would dominate all of Christendom. But soon, the Hussites would be woken up from their daydream by a new enemy.
It wasn't the Antichrist they all feared, but a man, Martin V, the newly elected Pope. After years of deliberation, the church finally got a new strong leader, and he wasn't one for compromises. He got the top job on the promise of bringing back order and stamping out division among the Christians. The stamping would be done by an iron boot, and the Hussites would be the first to feel its weight.
The Pope immediately proclaimed a series of edicts banning the movement. All Hussites would from this point on be considered heretics. The Pope wouldn't go after them personally, since he had enough problems elsewhere, but he chose a dependable middleman. The matter of the Bohemian rebels would be dealt with by King Sigismund of the Holy Roman Empire.
Sigismund, of course, had his own interests in the country. His brother Wenceslaus was growing older and weaker every day. And with no son to inherit the throne, Sigismund would soon add Bohemia to his growing collection of royal titles. His dream of a united Europe, standing firm against the threat of Islam from the south, was creeping ever closer. But first, he needed to deal with these rebellious fanatics stirring up trouble in his future kingdom.
There was a smarter way to go about this than a full-scale invasion, though. After all, why would Sigismund burn down the lands that he would soon own? Instead, the Holy Roman King arranged a meeting with leading Bohemian nobles, including the Supreme Burgrave Čeněk, the leader of the Hussite nobility.
Whatever everyone might have thought about Sigismund's reputation as a ruthless conqueror, it's undeniable that he was a skilled diplomat. His message to the assembled nobles was clear and seductive. He was going to become their next king, he reminded them. And when that happened, The Hussite nobles had nothing to fear from him. He wouldn't punish them for straying from the Catholic path. They were wise men, one and all, and Sigismund respected them immensely. The Hussite priests would be a different matter, of course. Sigismund would squash the radical heretics like the bugs they were.
What Sigismund had done was very clever and achieved two things at once. First, the king showed the Hussite nobles his more benevolent side and offered them future peaceful coexistence. They would now hesitate before declaring themselves Sigismund's enemies. Second, he created an immediate rift between the lords and the Hussite clergymen, who had, up to this point, worked together for mutual benefit. Would the lords really risk a fight when offered an easy way out? Would the priests trust them to? A classic divide and conquer scenario.
It was clear Sigismund's words struck a chord with many people, and soon the Hussites really began to splinter, exactly like Sigismund thought they would. But the name of the chief defector may surprise you: Czeniec of Württemberg, the leader of the moderate Hussite nobles and a fierce opponent of the Pope, suddenly distanced himself from the conflict. We don't exactly know what went through his head. Was he afraid of Sigismund? Did he take the last way out before the war inevitably broke out? Whatever it was, his withdrawal left the moderate Hussites without their key leader and supporter.
Unlike his supreme Burgrave, King Wenceslaus chose to resist his brother's policies. He hated Sigismund's encroachment into his kingdom and refused to stop supporting the Hussites. On the contrary, he became quite open in his sympathies towards them, such as when he appointed new city councillors, clearly leaning towards accepting the Hussite reforms.
While Sigismund may have taken a soft stance with the Hussite nobles, he had no patience for his foolish brother. Instead of subtle diplomacy, he sent him a threat. If the king of Bohemia did nothing against the Hussites, perhaps the best course of action would be to remove him from office. Wenceslaus couldn't take this lightly. Sigismund already imprisoned him once, and maybe he could do it again.
To make matters worse, the conservative elements turned their attention to Wenceslaus's wife, Queen Sophia of Bavaria. She was an obvious target since she had been a key supporter of the Hussites at the royal court. So one day, an envoy arrived from Rome, with what seemed less like an invitation and more like a summons. The message ordered the queen to travel to Italy and stand before the papal court. It was pretty obvious they weren't inviting her over for a friendly chat over a glass of wine.
The queen wisely chose not to accept and stayed in Prague. All the same, Wenceslaus was rattled. With his brother pressing him on one side, the Pope on the other, and his own nobles divided and squabbling, the king realized that openly supporting the Hussites had become too risky. But he wasn't ready to turn his back on them completely. So he set out to find a middle ground.
He convened a meeting, inviting the members of his royal council, representatives from the city of Prague, and a select group of important priests. There, Wenceslaus proposed a compromise. He wouldn't outright ban the Hussites, but to appease the church and Sigismund, they would have to lie low for a while. Their ceremonies would be restricted to private chapels, plus 3 specifically designated churches in the capital.
It was an ambitious plan, and one Wenceslaus genuinely believed in. Yes, the king's support of the Hussites may have been in part driven by pragmatism, because the divide among the nobility suited him politically. But he also really thought that the Hussites and the Catholics could peacefully coexist. They might enrich each other, and who knows, in time, they might even become united.
Wenceslaus misjudged the situation completely, however. Honestly, it was to be expected. Delicate diplomacy was never his strong suit, and he couldn't really grasp the depths of the religious radicalism that now gripped his country. Wenceslaus always hated godly fanatics and didn't understand them. But while all the rich men were sending envoys and had their meetings behind closed doors, the most radical Hussites, the poor from the cities and the countryside, had plans of their own. And for them, the era of seeking compromises had finally reached its end.
To understand this, we have to look at the lives of ordinary people in Bohemia at the time. For years, the country was ravaged by foreign armies and bandits. The breakdown in order meant that the daily reality of the commoners was full of poverty, hunger, sickness, and death.
The people who lived through such desperate times longed for a deeper, more personal connection with God. They saw their misfortune as proof that the end of the world was coming. The church, instead of providing satisfactory answers, gorged itself on riches it didn't deserve. But there was hope. The Hussites offered an alternative, especially those Hussites who weren't afraid to use extreme measures, such as a particular priest preaching in the city of Prague.
His name was Jan Želivský, and he came from a humble background. He used to be a member of the White Canons, an order of priests living a communal life similar to that of monks. Their days were mostly filled with prayers in a secluded countryside monastery. However, even the thick walls couldn't keep out the news of the changes brought about by Čeněk and his Hussites. For someone living under a strict set of rules, the idea of change must have been enticing. So when Želivský saw his chance, he seized it and defected from his monastery.
He traveled to the capital under the assumption that he could contribute to the ongoing revolution. And he did get a job at one of Prague's many churches. It didn't come with a lot of money, but Želivský was excited anyway. He started saving up for books, he read, and he studied, all with the aim of helping build a new, better Catholic Church.
Soon, Želivský started communicating with the people at the Prague University, the center of religious discourse in Bohemia. If he wanted to truly leave his mark on the movement, he would have to start there. But there was a problem. The majority of the professors immediately dismissed him as a complete nobody. Why should they care about what he had to say? Where did he get his education again? Oh, that's right, nowhere at all. He was only better than a peasant in that he could read, but that was hardly enough to conduct a proper philosophical debate.
This rejection hurt Želivský deeply. He did everything he possibly could. He made a leap into the unknown. And they laughed at him? Wasn't the Hussite movement supposed to bring the church back to the common man? He channeled his anger and frustration into his sermons. And soon, he found out that the professors were wrong about one thing at least. He might not be the most educated man around, but he was excellent at preaching and firing up the crowd.
It came naturally to Želivský to choose the right metaphor for the moment, to keep it simple so that his followers understood what he meant, to stoke their emotions and sense of justice. And he had grand ideas of his own. He spoke about a new world in which everyone would have to work for their daily bread. No one would be given something for nothing.
Želivský's poor little church soon became an attraction, and it seemed his career was about to finally take off, despite what the arrogant professors might think. But then came a heavy blow. Do you remember the compromise King Wenceslaus pushed through to solve the religious tension gripping his kingdom. The Hussites would from this point on be barred from all Prague churches except 3 specifically designated for this purpose. Of course, Želivský's backwater temple wasn't one of them. So, the talented preacher, thinking he would soon find his fame and fortune, instead suddenly found himself without a job.
It wasn't the end of the world for Želivský. His growing popularity was such that he soon found work in one of the approved churches. But it made him think, could he really trust the higher-ups that they wouldn't pull something like this again? Could an acceptable compromise with the Catholics be ever achieved? Probably not. The only answer was to fight tooth and nail. The Hussites had to fight, and they had to win.
While the poor masses of Prague were slowly getting ready to blow, the situation in the countryside wasn't much calmer. The villages, just like the streets of the capital, were full of impoverished, disillusioned people with deep sympathies towards the Hussite cause. And since they, thanks to King Wenceslaus and his compromise, had no chapels or churches of their own, they would congregate under the open sky, specifically on hills and mountains, as close to the face of God as possible.
These gatherings were simple. The chapel was often nothing fancier than a simple tent. Nevertheless, they quickly gained popularity. The regular church ceremonies could be cold and distant, whereas here, the atmosphere was warm and full of mutual care. The hundreds or even thousands of people meeting upon the hills addressed each other as brothers and sisters. And yet, there was an ever-present sense of foreboding. The communities were all nervously waiting for the impending arrival of the Antichrist.
The center of gravity of the Hussite movement now shifted from the elites to the commoners. The new radical wing was gathering more and more power and influence. At the same time, the moderate Hussites were confused and divided, as evidenced by Čeněk of Württemberg's yielding to Sigismund.
Jan Želivský was well aware of the situation in the countryside. He maintained constant communication with the organizers and may have even attended one of the gatherings himself. He liked what he saw, the preaching directed at the common folk, the intensity of their faith, and the strong sense of unity. All of this only strengthened his conviction that there was no turning back. The time for radical change had arrived.
Želivský himself was, meanwhile, fanning the flames back in Prague. His sermons were becoming more and more militant. One time, he told the biblical story of Judith, the woman who beheaded an enemy general. This had obvious implications. If you're tormented by the powerful, you're completely within your rights to do them harm and to kill them if necessary.
He also understood the importance of spreading the Hussite message outside of the church. So he organized parades through the city. He was often seen walking at the head of a crowd, carrying the monstrance fixed on a long pole, a holy object usually resembling a golden sun, symbolizing the victory of Christ. It was a sight to behold, which was surely Želivský's aim, to show that no matter what Sigismund or the Pope said, the Hussites were here to stay and weren't afraid to show their faces.
Želivský was clearly a bold man. But on a warm day in the middle of June, he did something so daring it borders on the unbelievable. That day, King Wenceslaus took a trip to the streets of his capital city. He went to visit the church of St. Apollinaris, an idyllic place on a hill surrounded by gardens and vineyards. But instead of a peaceful morning walk, he was ambushed. a large group of Hussites unexpectedly surrounded him. They weren't armed, but the sheer number of them made the king afraid.
We don't know for sure whether the orders came from Želivský, as he wasn't personally present. Most sources agree, however, that he was the mastermind behind the ambush. The Hussites delivered a request to the shocked king. He would once again let them preach in their own churches, and all the persecution of the reformists would stop. The situation was charged and unpredictable, but for once, Wenceslaus managed to stay diplomatic. He politely agreed to look at their plea, and the Hussites let him go. So it all ended peacefully. But once Wenceslaus was safe behind the walls of his castle, he exploded in rage.
How dare they accost the king? How dare they request anything of him in this manner? If they wanted to speak to him, they should have applied for an audience, not trap him in the street. This was an insult, a complete disregard for royal majesty. And who was responsible? Why, the very men Wenceslaus protected and shielded from the anger of his brother. Is this what gratitude looks like? Or is this the worst kind of treachery?
We shouldn't be surprised that Wenceslaus took it all very badly. The king had already been captured 2 times during his reign, and he was obviously very sensitive to any restrictions of his personal freedom. The Hussites should have known this, but either they didn't realize it or they simply didn't care. In any case, it soon became clear as day that Želivský miscalculated.
Wenceslaus acted swiftly. He sent the leader of the group that ambushed him near St. Apollinaris into exile. Some of the followers were imprisoned. He also dismissed the councillors of the new town of Prague, men who were sympathetic to the Hussites. In their place, he installed his own people, more Catholic and also completely loyal to the king. And in a stroke clearly aimed at Želivský himself, he banned religious processions through the city. King Wenceslaus, who for so long protected the Hussites, or at least stayed neutral towards them, now became their foe.
Jan Želivský was taken aback by this. In the notes he took at the time, he expressed his fears that soon King Wenceslaus would forbid the hilltop sermons as well. In his mind, the situation started to resemble the distant past in which the first Christians were persecuted by the dastardly Romans, and King Wenceslaus played the part of the bloodthirsty emperor.
Želivský didn't despair, though. This had happened to him once before, after all. He lost his job and his church because of what the king did. And it only made him stronger and more popular. So in a way, this new setback became a catalyst. Želivský decided on trying something big. Something that, as it turns out, would forever change the trajectory of the entire Hussite movement.
The first hints that trouble was brewing came from the king's spies who infiltrated one of the many hilltop gatherings. This particular meeting was one of the largest, reportedly drawing 40,000 attendees from across the kingdom. While everyone at the assembly spoke about love, brotherhood, and true faith in God, there were also more sinister whispers of concrete plans.
Some that reached Wenceslaus's ears were likely just rumors, such as talks of overthrowing the king. However, the spies also gathered information about an event planned on July the 30th. They didn't know what the Hussites' move would be exactly, only that it would be centered on the city hall in the new town of Prague. A city hall recently purged of Hussite councillors and newly staffed by the king's Catholic-leaning loyalists.
It happened on a Sunday. The morning, typically reserved for mass and peaceful rest, took on a different tone this time. Želivský in his church delivered a fiery sermon that stirred the crowd into a frenzy. It might have seemed spontaneous to some, but it was probably planned and prepared well in advance. After all, we know that many of the Hussites arrived fully armed.
Then the crowd marched upon the city hall. Their stated aim was to liberate the Hussites arrested for ambushing the king near St. Apollinaris a few weeks earlier. But the people outside the building weren't interested in negotiations. It's hard to tell what exact impulse led the mob to storm the city hall. Maybe they were ordered to do it by Želivský. Maybe he genuinely wanted to talk but couldn't keep the furious crowd under control. Either way, the wooden doors didn't represent much of an obstacle, nor did the dozen men inside, who were about to be brutally murdered.
Only 4 of them were actually the king's councillors, by the way. But the Hussites butchered everyone without mercy. They killed a friend of one of the councillors. They killed several craftsmen. They didn't even spare the servants. Anyone inside at the time of the assault was thrown out of the window and hacked to pieces by the armed mob in the street.
From a certain point of view, the First Defenestration of Prague was a stunning victory for the radical Hussites. They got rid of some of their powerful enemies and faced no immediate repercussions. But for Želivský, it represented the crossing of the Rubicon. He, a consecrated cleric, turned away from his oath and led the people on the path of open violence. Not only that, he directly challenged the power of the king. Before this incident, there was still a chance the simmering situation could be resolved peacefully. That chance evaporated as soon as the first councillor hit the pavement outside the city hall.
It was the start of a holy war where the usual lines between murder and justified killing disappeared. And it gave Želivský a new nickname, the Bloody Priest.
The aftermath of the massacre shows even more evidence that the whole thing was carefully planned. There was no looting or other kinds of spontaneous violence one would expect. The mob didn't even rob the bodies of the people they murdered. Instead, the Hussites immediately elected 4 temporary officials to govern the new town until new councillors could be elected. This wasn't just an angry outburst. It was an attempt at a coup.
Its success would depend on the reaction of the king. By now, many of you can probably guess the first thing Wenceslaus did when he learned the news. He got apocalyptically angry. Then he calmed down, got depressed, wallowed in self-pity, and finally agreed to everything the Hussites wanted. Želivský got a pretty reward for the defenestration. A city council elected not by the king, but by the people.
This was obviously unprecedented, a stunning breach of the law and the king's authority. But Wenceslaus simply didn't have the strength to fight anymore. From every corner of the kingdom, word reached him that radical Hussites, inspired by the defenestration, attacked and looted Catholic monasteries. The people he had tried so hard to protect betrayed him.
A week after the defenestration, Wenceslaus started complaining of a pain in his left arm. He looked tired, his spirit completely broken. After a couple of days, it seemed like he was getting better, but the opposite was true. In the afternoon, he experienced a devastating seizure, probably a heart attack. On the 16th of July, 1419, at the age of 58, King Wenceslaus of Bohemia died.
The news of the king's death spread throughout the country like wildfire. But instead of solemn respect for a king who rules the country for 40 long years, the mood was elated. It turned out that by now, everyone despised Wenceslaus. The Germans hated him because he couldn't be bothered to actually rule the Holy Roman Empire. The Bohemian Catholics hated him because he used to protect the Hussites. And the Hussites hated him because in trying to find a compromise, he became a useful substitute for the Antichrist. For basically everyone, his death was a welcome sign that marked the end of an unhappy era and the beginning of a new, hopeful one.
There was to be no grand funeral for the chosen heir of the great Emperor Charles, no procession through the streets of the capital. Wenceslaus was quietly buried in a simple ceremony within a monastery's grounds. Only the monks, bakers, and fishermen were there to bid him farewell.
Even after all this, the king was still not granted a peaceful rest. Less than a year later, a band of armed Hussites sacked the monastery. According to chronicles, they exhumed Wenceslaus's body, doused it with wine, and mockingly covered it in hay. They ended their rampage by setting the entire place ablaze. It was a local fisherman who recovered the king's remains and secretly interred them, awaiting calmer times.
4 years passed before Wenceslaus was finally moved to St. Vitus Cathedral, the burial site of his father. This also happened to be the resting place Wenceslaus specifically wished to avoid. He never forgot his bitter dispute with Jan of Jenstein 3 decades ago that escalated into the death of an innocent man. The cathedral, whose construction Jenstein supervised, served as a painful reminder of that conflict. Unfortunately for Wenceslaus, who had many unfulfilled wishes throughout his life, even his final one wasn't granted.
No one can be sure what exactly went through the head of King Sigismund. Was he mourning his brother? Was he indifferent to the loss of someone who had long ago lost his respect? Was he happy that the last obstacle on his way to the crown of Bohemia disappeared? In any case, Wenceslaus's death must have come as a surprise to Sigismund, or it at least came with the worst timing imaginable. Why? Well, Sigismund was completely unprepared for what was to follow.
He couldn't immediately move to seize power in Bohemia because he was in Hungary at that time, on a military campaign against the Turks. So he delegated the rule of the Kingdom of Bohemia to our 2 old acquaintances, Sophia of Bavaria, the Queen Widow, and Czeniec of Württemberg, the Supreme Burgrave of Bohemia.
This clearly wasn't the perfect setup for Sigismund. Queen Sophia was sympathetic to the Hussites, as was Czeniec. He may have distanced himself from the conflict with Sigismund and the Pope, but he was still much closer to the Hussites than the Catholics. But the King of Hungary didn't really have a choice. He needed someone the Bohemian nobility would accept for the regency, someone who could maintain the peace until Sigismund returned to claim his throne.
Unfortunately, peace was in short supply in Central Europe, and some people were getting more ambitious by the day. It soon showed. After Wenceslaus's death, according to legal customs of the day, the Bohemian nobility could now negotiate with the new king for concessions. Think of it as a new contract after a change in management. And the Czech nobles quickly realized they might have a strong hand to play. They could afford to demand quite a lot from the absent, busy king.
Their demands were quite something. If Sigismund read them during dinner, he probably choked on his chicken. The moderate Hussites had a big say among the nobility, and it showed. The king was told that the Kingdom of Bohemia would allow the Hussite rights, including the communion under both kinds. The priests would be forbidden to own property. The church services would be conducted in Czech language, and every decree and decision sent by the Pope would have to be approved by the king.
It wasn't all about religion either. The national aspect also played a role. The demands of the nobility clearly sought to improve the circumstances of the Czech population and put down the many Germans living in the kingdom. Only Czechs would be allowed to serve in the bureaucracy, for example. The same was true for the leadership of the cities. All trials would be conducted in Czech, and no foreign judge would be allowed to pass judgment on Czech citizens.
Sigismund wasn't thrilled by this at all. He was at the borders of Christian Europe, risking his life fighting against the terrible Ottoman Empire, protecting them all from the ever-approaching rise of Islam, the danger he warned everyone about all his life. And the ungrateful fools tried to pull something like this? No, this would not stand. Sigismund would deal with the Turks as best he could, and then he would deal with Bohemia.
He would have to be patient, however. He sent the nobles a letter in which he permitted the communion under both kinds, at least until he returned to the country. Then there would be a new discussion and possibly a new decision. In short, Sigismund was buying himself some time, even if he knew that this Hussite nonsense was something that he would never allow in the long term.
If Sigismund wasn't interested in a compromise, there was another faction which felt the same way. The radical elements of the Hussites, the poor and the downtrodden, mainly concentrated in the countryside. The moderate Hussite nobility wanted the reformers and the Catholics in Bohemia to live side by side, the so-called Kingdom of Two Peoples. The radicals wanted the Catholics gone. The church was too corrupt, too far gone, and it was quite possible that the Pope was the Antichrist. A completely new beginning was needed.
If this meant defying the nobles, so be it. What were they good for anyway? They didn't care about the troubles of the poor. They never experienced starvation or homelessness. Their families weren't dying out in plague epidemics. And haven't the radicals already proven they were strong? The defenestration worked like a charm. Why couldn't they go a few steps further?
So the radicals went to Prague, the capital and the center of power. And at first, it looked like a peaceful visit. The more moderate Hussites in Prague welcomed their countryside brothers and sisters with open arms. They talked about God and the new world that was coming. They drank, ate, and celebrated.
But soon, the atmosphere changed. The radicals started to call the shots in the city. They stopped celebrating and started attacking churches instead. The radical wing of the Hussites didn't like unnecessary luxuries such as paintings and golden ornaments, so they were looted or thrown away.
The division became steadily worse over the next month. Parties and friendly debates were replaced by rows, arguments, and fisticuffs. Then it all culminated in a literal conflagration. In one district of Prague, the escalating violence prompted the Supreme Burgrave Čeněk to send in his troops. But instead of restoring peace, what followed was days of bloody street fighting between the soldiers and the radicals. In the end, a large part of the city was left in smoking ruins.
The moderate Hussites in Prague were stunned by this development. They welcomed the radicals as siblings in Christ, and now they were burning down their homes. Why were they even fighting against Lord Čeněk? He was a Hussite after all, and even if he now ruled thanks to an agreement with the hated Sigismund,
He was the one who tried to protect Master Jan Hus all those years ago.
What was worse, the radicals were actually winning. They could hold their own against Čeněk's men and even managed to take the Vyšehrad Castle, an important strategic position. Queen Sophia, concerned about her safety, fled the city. Čeněk, with his back against the wall, called up German mercenaries to defend Prague Castle. In short, it seemed the radicals were poised to take over Prague, and with it, perhaps the whole kingdom.
Fairly or unfairly, thanks to the successes of the radicals, the capital was now seen as a hotbed of zealotry by those outside the city. Soon, more than 100 noblemen declared themselves enemies of Prague. 4 major cities followed. What began as a brotherly celebration now threatened to become a full-fledged civil war.
But now, it was the radicals' turn to be surprised. They may have successfully stood against Čeněk and his men, but they couldn't stay in the city for long if they lost the support of the population. And that is exactly what happened. The more moderate Hussite elements, which were dominant among the people of Prague, reacted to the brewing chaos by going behind the radicals' back. They signed a separate peace treaty with Čeněk and the Queen. The radicals suddenly found themselves without allies they counted on. So, instead of storming Prague Castle, they sounded the retreat back to the countryside.
This was a humiliating setback for the radical Hussites. They had the city in the palms of their hands. There was even talk about electing a new king for themselves. In an instant, it was all gone. The mentality of the people in the capital and in the countryside was simply too far removed, as were their goals. The radical Hussites had thought Prague was their Jerusalem, the chosen city of God. As they left its gates behind, they found it to be the cursed Babylon.
Some of them dispersed back to the countryside. Others left for the other major city in the vicinity, Pilsen, where they hoped to find more welcome. But the bitterness they felt wouldn't disappear overnight. The radicals were more than ready to continue the fight and avenge themselves on those who had wronged them. Among them, a particular man, a seasoned military commander, a man with only one eye, a man who would become legendary as one of the best generals who ever lived. Both the Catholics and the treacherous moderates would soon pay. Jan Žižka was ready to claim his place in the history books.
A big thank you to everyone who's helping make this podcast happen, especially to Bohumil Červený and Martin Baláš, our Jan Žižka's own patrons. Thanks so much, guys.